The monitors had been running for 11 days straight. Nobody in Facility 9 had slept more than 4 hours in a row since the containment pods registered the first biological surge. The night shift supervisor, a man named Caldwell, who had spent 12 years handling Vought's most classified acquisitions, had stopped filing incident reports after day 3. Not because nothing was happening, because what was happening had no category in any form he'd ever been trained to fill out. The facility itself sat 400 feet below a drainage basin in rural Virginia. No signs, no fences worth mentioning. A maintenance road that fed into a gravel lot used by a shell company that theoretically processed agricultural equipment. 11 layers of clearance to reach the bottom level, and even then, most of the personnel on floors 1 through 9 had been told they were monitoring a biological anomaly recovered from a deep-sea excavation site. Standard cover. Standard quarantine protocol. Standard everything. Floor 10 was not standard. Floor 10 was a curved chamber the size of a football field stripped of most of its original equipment to make room for the containment architecture the science team had built over 8 months. The mass at the center of the room had been designated Black Asset Zero by Stan Edgar personally in a memo that went to 4 people and was immediately flagged for permanent deletion from Vought's primary servers. Edgar had seen enough in his career to know that some assets required a name that communicated nothing to anyone who wasn't already in the room. The mass had arrived as something between solid and not. The recovery team that brought it in from the secondary site in Nevada had described it in their debrief as feeling like standing near a generator, a constant pressure behind the eyes, a faint metallic taste at the back of the throat, a sense that the air was slightly thinner than it should be. 3 of the 7 team members had requested psychiatric evaluations within a week of the transfer. 1 had quit entirely. The science team had been studying the mass since its arrival. They had cataloged its cellular composition or tried to the structures didn't match any taxonomy in any database Vought had built over 2 decades of black site biological research, not the alien tissue recovered from the Nevada site, not the compound V byproducts, not anything. They had measured its energy output in 3 different units and come up with 3 different answers, none of which were stable. They had run 17 types of stimulation protocols. In 14 of those, nothing visible happened. In the other 3, 2 members of the team had experienced nosebleeds severe enough to require medical attention, and every camera on floor 10 had briefly lost feed. Tonight, the readings were different. Caldwell stood at the main monitoring station and watched the primary biometric graph doing something it had never done before. The line, which for 11 days had traced a flat, slow oscillation, barely distinguishable from baseline noise, was climbing. Not spiking. Climbing with a kind of deliberateness that made his stomach move in an unpleasant direction. He called Dr. Yuen, the lead scientist, and she arrived in under 3 minutes, which told him she hadn't been asleep either. "That's not a fluctuation," she said, looking at the screen. "No. That's a progression." "Yes." She pulled up the secondary grid and the tertiary thermal readings and the real-time cellular scan, and all 3 of them were doing the same thing. Climbing. Slow, even purposeful. Like something counting down from the inside. "Get security to double the post at the access points," Caldwell said. "Floor 10 and 9 both." "Already done," said the guard captain from the corner of the room. His name was Reyes. He had 18 men on floor 10 and another 12 staged on 9. He had also quietly and without filing a formal request, moved his personal sidearm from his hip holster to a drop holster on his thigh where he could reach it faster. "What are we looking at?" Nobody answered. The thermal reading peaked. The biometric line went vertical. Every screen in the monitoring station flickered once, then came back on and on. The containment feed, the single most heavily armored camera in the facility, suspended from a reinforced mount directly above the mass. Something moved. not twitched, not shifted, moved, with intention. The mass began to open. Later in the after-action reconstruction, that Vought's internal investigators would spend weeks trying to piece together the sequence of events on floor 10 would be described in the passive voice throughout the entire document, because no one who had been present could agree on exactly what they had seen, and several of them were no longer available to interview. What the cameras captured in the 47 seconds before they were destroyed was this. The mass unfolded along lines that were both biological and structural. The way a plant unfolds, or a fist opens, not exploding outward, but extending deliberate with the patience of something that had been waiting a long time and had decided the wait was finished. The containment field, layered systems, each independently powered, each designed to hold things far beyond human physical capability, registered strain on all 6 layers. Simultaneously, then registered nothing at all, because the sensors measuring the strain had stopped functioning. A figure stood in the center of what had been the mass. She was lean in the way of something built for efficiency rather than display every line of her, a compromise between speed and lethality. Her skin carried the residue of the process that had reformed her, not quite the color of anything human, marked with faint geometric patterns that caught the emergency lighting and turned it cold. Behind her shoulders, the biological architecture of her upper back had already begun its extension, dark protrusions that moved with her breathing like something alive. Her hair was not hair in the conventional sense. It fell in heavy dark strands that seemed to carry their own weight, each one slightly too thick, slightly too deliberate in its movement. Her face was human enough to be readable and alien enough to make reading it feel dangerous. She stood very still for 4 seconds. Then she looked at the cameras. The security team opened fire. What happened in the next 2 minutes and 40 seconds would later be described by the 2 survivors, Caldwell, who had retreated to floor 9 at Reyes's direct order, and a junior technician named Park, who had been in the server alcove when everything started as not quite like anything they had words for. Both of them independently used the same phrase in their separate debriefs. It felt like watching the building decide to become something else. She moved through the security post at the north access point without breaking stride. The rounds that Reyes's team put into the air between them and her stopped. Not deflected, stopped, suspended at intervals in the corridor like a frozen moment from a film hanging there while she passed beneath them. Then they continued their trajectories into the wall behind her. 2 men in tactical gear found themselves lifted from the floor before they understood what was pulling them. They didn't fall. They were placed against the ceiling with a kind of precision that was almost worse than if she'd thrown them, and held there until they stopped struggling, and then sat down. She took out the primary security station with one hand extended. The reinforced door of the monitoring center buckled inward, along lines that matched a handprint scaled up by a factor of 10. The steel folding like cloth, the locking mechanisms shearing from their housings and dropping to the floor in pieces. She left most of the security personnel breathing. The ones who stopped engaging, she stepped around. The ones who didn't. The guard captain, who charged her with a blade and a great deal of conviction. She stopped mid-stride, lifted with nothing she was visibly doing, and held suspended in the air at exactly the height where he could see her face, while she studied him the way something studies an obstacle it has already categorized. Then she closed her hand. Not around him, just closed it. The sound his body made inside his armor was very specific and very final. She set him down, after which was somehow the part that stayed with Caldwell longest. The server room took 40 seconds. She burned it from the inside, the heat source originating somewhere in the architecture of her right hand. And she moved through the facility's data infrastructure with the focus of someone who had known what she was looking for before she woke up. She pulled the main communication relay at minute 2. The kill switch for the external alert system a few seconds after, not by finding the panel, but by pushing something outward from her palm that hit the relay housing and reduced it to a fused lump of slag in a single pulse. Clean. Targeted. The kind of precision that cost nothing. She left one line active. One single upward-facing signal, thin as a wire, pointed at the surface. Pointed at whoever was at the other end of it. Caldwell watched her on the last functioning screen on floor 9, a secondary monitoring feed that she had either not found or chosen not to destroy, and saw her turn at the end and look directly at that camera, the one she had left running. And he understood, in the way that you understand things, your brain would prefer not to process, that this had been the point. Not an oversight. A message. She stood in the wreckage of floor 10, surrounded by bent metal and broken concrete and the scattered evidence of 11 months of Vought's most classified research. And she looked at the camera for exactly 3 seconds. Then she walked toward the access shaft. Stan Edgar received the feed at 2:47 in the morning. He was in his home office, which he used more than his bedroom on most nights, sitting behind a desk that contained nothing he hadn't put there himself and nothing he couldn't account for. His assistant had flagged the signal as priority red, and his assistant did not use that designation lightly. He watched the 47 seconds of containment footage. Then the secondary feed from floor 9. Then the timestamp log of every system that had gone dark in sequence. He watched it twice. Then he called 3 people, not 4, not 2, and issued a set of instructions that took less than 90 seconds to deliver. The first call was to the head of Vought's Internal Security Division. The second was to his head of Legal and Narrative Containment. The third was to Ashley Barrett, who answered on the second ring because she slept with her phone in her hand and had learned the hard way what missing a call at 3 a.m. cost her. "There's a situation," Edgar said. "What kind of?" "The kind you don't ask questions about on this line. I need a public narrative ready to deploy by 6. Unidentified biological threat potential, super origin currently being assessed. Vague enough to hold for 72 hours. I want nothing about Facility 9 anywhere in that narrative. Not the location, not the project designation, not the recovery timeline." Ashley was quiet for 2 seconds. He could hear her breathing change as she processed. "That's going to be hard to sell if something surfaces on Make It Work." He ended the call and looked at the still frame he had paused the footage on. The image from the secondary camera on floor 9, slightly degraded, slightly off angle. A woman standing in the ruin of his most expensive project, looking directly into a lens she had chosen not to destroy. Edgar had been doing this for a long time. He had managed assets that could level city blocks. He had managed the egos of beings who believed themselves gods and were not entirely wrong. He understood at a structural level the difference between a problem and a threat. This was the first time in 11 years that something had made him revise that taxonomy in real time. He picked up his phone again and began making the calls that would start the network moving. Assets relocated. Data transferred. The black infrastructure of Vought's most hidden operations folding and refolding itself like a living thing, pulling away from the point of breach, redistributing. He didn't call Homelander. Not yet. What had walked out of floor 10 tonight had looked at the camera on its way out. It had left the signal running on purpose. And it had done both of those things not because it wanted to announce itself, but because it wanted something to start moving. Edgar understood that. He had spent his career making things move in the directions he chose. He spent 4 minutes looking at that paused frame before he closed the feed. Then, he started making the network run. The press line went out at 6:04 a.m. 4 minutes behind schedule, which was Ashley Barrett's fault, and she knew it, and she had already drafted the internal memo apologizing for it before the release even cleared the server. Vought International is aware of an unverified report of super-origin biological activity in a non-populated area of rural Virginia. Our teams are actively assessing the situation. Public safety remains our highest priority. We will provide updates as verified information becomes available. 47 words. Nothing confirmable, nothing deniable. A sentence designed to be read aloud by a news anchor and then immediately forgotten. While they cut to a chyron about a congressman doing something stupid. Ashley had written hundreds of them. She could produce one in her sleep, and in this case, she essentially had given that she'd been awake since 3 a.m. and was now standing in a Vought Communications sub-office on the 14th floor, mainlining her third coffee, while her deputy ran the monitoring dashboard and called out every outlet that had picked up the release. CNN, Fox, AP, Reuters, her deputy said. A P's already asking for a follow. Tell them we'll have more within the hour. Will we? Ashley looked at him over the rim of her cup. He was 26 and had been in his job for 8 months and still believed there was a version of his job that didn't involve lying to wire services before sunrise. Tell them we'll have more within the hour, she said again. And 3 floors up in a conference room that had been swept for recording devices 90 minutes earlier, Stan Edgar sat at the head of a table with 5 people and listened to the damage assessment with the expression of a man reviewing a quarterly report he had already read. The head of internal security had 12 pages. Edgar let him get through 4 before he stopped him. I don't need the methodology. Give me the current exposure. Facility 9 is a total loss. All physical infrastructure on floors 8 through 10. Server architecture is gone. The recovery team we had on site is down to 2 personnel, both in medical. 3 are unaccounted for. We're assuming the rest are, what did she take? A pause. The security head, whose name was Brannigan and who had done 3 tours before Vought, chose his words with the caution of a man who understood that some answers changed the nature of a meeting. The data on floors 8 and 9 was destroyed. Floor 10 Research Archive, destroyed. But the deep access terminal on sub-level 3, the one with the unlinked backup chain, we think she accessed it before the burn. We can't confirm what was pulled. Edgar looked at the table for a moment. So she may have a partial map of our secondary infrastructure. It's possible. Not possible. Likely. Edgar straightened a pen that was already straight. She was specific about what she destroyed and what she accessed. That's not random. What else? Brannigan flipped 2 pages. The relay she left active, we traced it. It was pointed at a dormant uplink node we use for emergency asset transfer signaling. She didn't just leave a line open. She left a line open that we would have to use to start moving things. The room was quiet for a moment, in a way that felt deliberate. Edgar said, she wanted the network to move. Nobody disagreed with him. He looked at the woman to his left, legal counsel, a thin woman named Park who had worked for Vought since the mid-90s and whose loyalty had been purchased so completely it was indistinguishable from genuine, and said, "What's our exposure on Facility 9 specifically? Contractual negligible. The facility doesn't exist in any document attached to the parent company. Regulatory 0, same reason. If it surfaces in press, we have 3 layers of shell attribution between the address and anything traceable to us. The bigger risk is the asset records. Yes." Edgar closed the folder in front of him. How many black sites are currently active with paper trails that connect to 9, 11? 4 of those have live subjects. Start the rollout. Brannigan looked up. Full rollout all 11. All 11. Stagger it so it doesn't look like a single event on any traffic monitoring. Move the live subject sites first. Data archives second, the clean facilities last. I want everything repositioned within 48 hours. He stood, which in this room meant the meeting was over. and keep Homelander off the operational briefing. He's going to ask. Let him ask. Tell him it's under control. Park said quietly. Is it? Edgar buttoned his jacket. It was under control until it wasn't. Now it's a logistics problem. He walked to the door and paused without turning. Make sure Ashley's line holds. I don't care what she has to promise the AP. The narrative has to stay boring for at least 72 hours. It was not, in fact, under control. Homelander found out at 9 a.m., which was 3 hours after he should have found out, which he knew, because he had a contact inside Vought's internal communications infrastructure, whose value was specifically that she told him things Edgar's office chose not to route to him. What she told him was enough. He read the summary twice, standing at the window of his penthouse floor at Vought Tower, with the kind of stillness that people who worked in the building had learned to treat as a weather warning. A biological asset of unknown classification had breached containment at a facility he had never been told existed. It had destroyed the facility. It had killed or incapacitated most of the personnel, and the first response was not to call him, but to spin a press line and move boxes. He had been the face of this company's power for longer than he could bother counting. He was, by every metric that mattered to him, the most dangerous presence on the planet. And Stan Edgar had chosen to handle this the way he handled a bad earnings report. Homelander set his phone down on the windowsill with the deliberate care of a man who wanted very badly to put it through the glass. He called Edgar's direct line. I heard, Edgar said before Homelander could speak. Then you know I should have been in that room this morning. You're in this conversation now. That's not... Homelander stopped. Reset. The public-facing version of himself was very good at resetting. And sometimes that version was the only thing standing between a conversation and something that couldn't be walked back. What is this thing, sir? Unknown classification. Super origin, almost certainly. Psionic capability well above anything in our current registry. We're gathering more data. From what you said, the facility is gone. We have secondary sources. I want access to those sources. You'll be briefed when the picture is complete. The line held for 4 seconds. Edgar. Homelander's voice had dropped to the register he used when he was communicating something he considered obvious. There is something out there that just walked through one of your black sites like it was a paper bag. And your strategy is to brief me when it's convenient for you. My strategy, Edgar said, is to gather complete information before acting, which is generally how effective decisions are made. Send me the footage. We're processing. Send me the footage. Another pause, shorter. I'll have something to you by noon, Edgar said. In the meantime, you have the Seattle charity event at 3. Don't miss it. We need the camera time right now. The line went dead. Homelander stood at the window for a long moment. Outside 40 stories below Manhattan moved with its usual indifference. Traffic pedestrians, the small machinery of a city that did not know or care what was being decided above it. He had studied this view more times than he could count. It had always felt like the right vantage point. This morning, something was happening somewhere he couldn't see. The people who were supposed to route information to him had decided what he was allowed to know. He was being managed, which was a thing that happened to assets, not to him. And everyone involved in making that decision was going to find out exactly how wrong they were. He picked up his phone again. He did not call Edgar back. He started making his own inquiries. By midday, 4 of Vaught's 11 active black sites had begun their relocation sequences. Unmarked vehicles on staggered departure schedules. Data transferred through encrypted channels to receiving facilities with no publicly accessible address. Personnel moved in small groups through civilian transport to minimize the kind of signature that showed up on federal monitoring software. The operation had a name, black asset rollout, and it had been built by a committee over 18 months for exactly this scenario, the need to make a large number of sensitive things disappear without the dispersal pattern becoming visible. The protocol was thorough, professional, exactly what a company like Vought would build. It was also in a way that none of the people executing it fully grasped a broadcast. Every vehicle that moved was a signal. Every encrypted transfer created a node. Every personnel rotation left a rhythm in the noise that was not random, not accidental, and entirely legible to something that had already seeded itself into the frequencies Vought used to coordinate its most protected operations. The first convoy hit trouble at 2:17 p.m. on Interstate 81, 40 miles south of Harrisonburg. Bachaite. Transport 7's team lead was a man named Galvin, who had run this route 4 times without incident. 3 vehicles lead SUV midsection cargo vehicle carrying 2 hard cases of encrypted drives and 1 sealed biometric container trailing SUV with 4 security personnel. 8 men total, all former military, all cleared to the level this work required. The route had been scouted that morning. Weather clear, no anomalies flagged at departure. At mile marker 114, the cargo vehicle's power steering failed. Standard protocol, roadside stop, transfer to backup transport, continue on alternate route. Galvin had his team out and reconfiguring within 90 seconds. The backup vehicle was 12 minutes out. The backup vehicle never arrived. What preceded her was a pressure shift, a drop in the surrounding air, that one of his team later described as the atmosphere deciding to move in a direction that wasn't any of the 4 cardinal ones. The trailing SUV's team lead called a visual at the tree line. Then his voice stopped. The cargo vehicle left the ground. That was what Galvin kept coming back to in the days after, not the violence of it, but the absence of violence. It rose the way something rises, when a crane has it measured level with the patience of a force that had no need to hurry. It went up 15 feet hung, and then the rear panels separated from the body as though something had found the seam between exterior and interior and decided the distinction was no longer useful. The hard cases dropped to the asphalt. The biometric container rolled to the median. 2 of his men ran for the container. They covered 8 steps before they stopped, not knocked flat, not thrown, just arrested mid-stride, held upright in postures they hadn't chosen, like marionettes whose strings had gone rigid. Galvin watched one of them strain against nothing visible, watched the neck cord and the jaw tighten, and absolutely nothing give, and understood in a very direct way that the geometry of the situation had changed. The guard closest to her, a former ranger named DeSoto, who had the instinct to keep moving when others froze, actually reached the container. He got one hand on the biometric seal before something seized him from the outside in. Not a grip in the conventional sense, more like pressure finding every surface of him simultaneously. The way water fills a container, except this was selective and deliberate, and it found the specific architecture of his rib cage and told it to stop expanding outward. He went to his knees, making a sound he would not describe to the debriefers. She held him there for 4 seconds, then released. Galvin saw her clearly for 3 seconds. She stood over the cracked hard case. Her right palm came down flat against the lock housing, and a focused pulse moved through the metal. Not heat, not impact, but concentrated force that traveled inward and turned the locking mechanism to slag from the inside out in under a second. The case opened. She removed the drive assembly. She stood. She looked at him the way you look at something you've already categorized. He had worked for Vought 9 years. He had stood in the same room as Homelander and felt what that particular threat weighed. Homelander was enormous and loud, and wanted you to understand the scale of what it was dealing with. That was its own kind of fear, the fear of something that needed to be witnessed. This was different. This was a thing that had noted his presence and filed him under irrelevant. She took the drives. She took the container. She walked back into the tree line and was gone before he finished keying his radio. The Transport 7 report reached Edgar's desk at 4:45 p.m. He read it once, turned it face down, and sat with the arithmetic for a moment. She had not hit the first convoy, not the second, which had already reached its destination clean. She had hit the third, the first one to depart, after Vought activated the relay network to coordinate the rollout. She had tracked the pattern from the moment they began broadcasting their own dispersal, not from any physical surveillance of the routes themselves. She was reading the network, not the roads. The network. He made 4 calls in 20 minutes. 3 were operational, accelerate the remaining sites, change routing methodology, entirely prepare liability, insulation for the highway incident. The 4th was from the phone in his desk drawer, the one that didn't live in his pocket, and the conversation lasted under 2 minutes. And afterward, he locked the drawer and did not mention the call to anyone in the room. He sat for a long moment after that. Not because he was shaken. Edgar did not permit himself the luxury of being shaken by events he hadn't anticipated. That was a form of ego he'd excised a long time ago. He sat because he was updating his model. She had taken something specific from Facility 9's backup terminal. She had left the relay active, knowing they'd use it. She had let the first 2 convoys run without interference, then hit the 3rd to demonstrate she could pick and choose. Everything she had done since walking out of that facility was structured, sequential, pointing somewhere. The question was not how to stop her. The question, which Edgar was beginning to understand, was the only question that mattered, was where she was pointing. The data reached Butcher at 7 p.m. through a source inside Vaught's mid-level logistics chain, a man named Wells who had a gambling problem and a daughter, and the particular combination of financial pressure and moral flexibility that made him exactly the kind of person Butcher kept available for moments like this. Wells hadn't known what he was passing along. He'd flagged a routing anomaly, 7 simultaneous asset transfers from black designated facilities, all initiated within a 4-hour window, all using the emergency dispersal protocol Vought reserved for existential liability events. Butcher had read worse intelligence and better lighting. He spread the documents across the table in the back room of a bar in Alexandria that Mother's Milk had rented for the night. Huey was running the laptop with the expression he got when the numbers were doing something he hadn't built a category for yet. Frenchie was at the window with a takeaway container and the kind of surface inattention that meant his brain was doing serious work somewhere underneath. Mother's Milk stood at the wall map they'd put together 2 hours earlier, tracing routes with one finger. 7 sites, Mother's Milk said. That's not precautionary movement. That's a full pull. Watch that. Full and fast. Butcher tapped the Transport 7 excerpt that Wells had included, partial 3 redactions pulled from a mid-management chain that hadn't been cleaned yet. Convoy gets hit on the 81. Whatever did it didn't go after the first one or the second. Went after the 3rd, which was the first one to move after Vought lit up their relay network to start the rollout. So it was already in their communications when they started running, Frenchie said, sitting inside their relay, waiting for them to show it where everything was going. Butcher dropped into his chair. They left a signal active at Facility 9. Vought used that signal to kick the rollout. And whatever came out of that facility used the rollout itself as a bloody address book. Huey said carefully, it wanted them to run. Wanted them to move. Running is panic. Moving is logistics, assets, locations, routes, the kind of infrastructure that's almost impossible to locate unless the people hiding it start shuffling it in a hurry while someone's already inside their lines. Mother's Milk looked away from the map. That's not how soups operate. No, Butcher said. It's not. The room sat with that. "What do we do?" Huey asked. "We track every site we can pull from Wells's data. We map the pattern." Butcher stood and grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair. "Whatever this is, it's not going after bystanders. Not going after random noise. It's going after the things Vought is most desperate to keep underground." He paused at the door. "Far as I'm concerned, that's the most useful thing I've seen in 6 years of doing this." Mother's Milk said, "You're thinking about using it." "I'm thinking about watching which way it points." Butcher pulled the door open, and making sure Homelander happens to be standing somewhere in that direction when it arrives. The Virginia shoulder where Transport 7 had stopped was empty by nightfall. The damaged cargo vehicle was at a Vought depot. Galvin's team had been extracted and debriefed. The incident report had made its way up the chain-flagged priority and been forwarded to a desk where it would be read and acted on in ways that would be logged nowhere accessible. To the north, 7 more convoys ran through the dark, each one on a new route, each one burning different channels, each one leaving behind it the thin legible residue of a system moving because it was afraid, and in moving marking every location it most wanted to protect. She wasn't chasing them. She was reading the map they were drawing for her. The storage depot outside Manassas was 12,000 square feet of corrugated steel on a fenced lot with no signage owned on paper by a holding company, 3 layers removed from anything traceable to Vought. The kind of property that existed in the infrastructure, the way load-bearing walls exist in old buildings, unremarkable, essential, invisible, until something decided to go through it. Butcher found it because Wells had flagged it as a secondary node in the rollout routing data and because the local police scanner had gone briefly strange at 4 a.m. A partial call unit dispatched to a structure fire reported by a passing motorist. Then a cancellation from dispatch that used language no actual dispatcher would use unless someone with Vaught's reach had called ahead, 7 in the morning, before the cleanup team. The fence had been opened from the inside. Not cut, not blown. The steel posts had been bent outward along their base welds, with a kind of force that suggested whoever had done it was not inconvenienced by the resistance. The main loading bay doors were still on their tracks, but the locking bar had been pressed through the door housing itself, not broken. The metal around it had compressed inward uniformly, a circular deformation, roughly the diameter of a closed hand, as if someone had decided the lock was a minor anatomical detail of a larger structure they were rearranging. "Don't touch anything," Mother's Milk said, because that was what you said even when you already knew no one was going to listen. They went in. The depot's interior was divided into 3 sections by a partial wall that had been added after Vought took ownership. The front third was empty storage shelving, stripped floors swept to a standard that had nothing to do with legitimate warehousing. The middle third was where the data architecture had lived, rows of server housing cable management systems, running floor to ceiling, a climate control unit still running. Because whatever had happened here had not touched the climate control. The back third, behind a fire door that now hung at a 20-degree angle from a single hinge, was the part that stopped them at the threshold. Frenchie said very quietly, "Merde." Then remembered and didn't say anything else. The server housing in the middle section was intact. That was the first thing Butcher noted, because it was unexpected. He had assumed fire explosion, the crude vocabulary of violence he was used to reading. Instead, the server housing was physically undamaged, except for the panels, which had been removed, all of them, and stacked with a neatness that was somehow worse than destruction would have been. The drives inside had been extracted, not ripped out, removed. Whatever had taken them had known exactly which ones to take and left the housing organized in a way that communicated very clearly that the precision had been deliberate. "Server pulls are clean," Frenchie said, crouching near the empty housing. He was running a compact EM scanner he'd built from components that didn't officially exist. Not clean like professional clean like something that knew what it was looking for without having to look. Residual? Butcher asked. Psionic heat signature, maybe. Hard to read this long after. But the temperature differential in this corner is wrong for a normal fire. He stood. Whatever burned the secondary drives, the ones it didn't want, burned them from the inside. Same pattern as Facility 9 per the report we pulled. Inside out, Mother's Milk said. Inside out. Huey had moved to the back section and stopped at the door. He was looking at the floor without going through. Butcher, he said. 3 Vought security personnel had been on overnight rotation at the depot. The after-action report Wells would eventually pass along would describe them as deceased due to structural collapse, which was the kind of language that required you to not look too closely at the structural evidence. Butcher looked closely. The first man was near the east wall. He was on his back. His sidearm was still in his holster, which told you the Confrontation had moved too fast for a draw, and his tactical vest had compressed inward at the sternum, in a pattern that was not consistent with any blunt force impact. Butcher had seen in 20 years of operating in places where people hit each other with heavy things. It was as if the vest and the chest inside it had experienced pressure from every direction, simultaneously briefly, and then the pressure had released. The bones under the vest had not recovered the same way. Near his right hand, the radio unit he'd been reaching for had a hole through it. Not a bullet hole, a puncture that went straight through the casing. The circuit board, and out the other side, the edges fused rather than torn, the signature of something focused and very fast that had traveled in a straight line from a specific point and hit exactly where it was aimed. He had been reaching for the radio. The radio had been addressed before he got there. The second was near the fire door. Same vest compression, same holster still fastened. The third was different. He was against the wall at approximately shoulder height, not on the floor. His boots were 6 inches off the ground. He had been held there, and the mark his back had made against the wall during the holding was still visible, a vertical smear that told you the duration had been long enough for him to struggle, and the struggle had been completely ineffective. And at some point he had stopped struggling and gone still before whatever had been holding him finished the job. Butcher stood in front of that wall for a long time. Huey said from behind him, they didn't have a chance. They had exactly as much of a chance as it wanted to give them, Butcher said, which was none. That's the same thing. No, it's not. He turned away from the wall. One means they got unlucky. The other means this thing decided their status before they even knew it was in the room. Mother's Milk was reading something on his phone near the entrance, which meant he'd pulled the scanner feed from their external unit and was going through it rather than standing in this particular room any longer than necessary. Butcher respected that. MM had a threshold that was not cowardice, and he was standing close to it. Third site confirmed overnight. Mother's Milk said, not looking up. Convoy intercept on Route 7, similar profile. 3 vehicles security detail data package. Everything gone. 2 survivors who can't describe much beyond a pressure change, and then waking up on the shoulder. She's not killing cleanup, Butcher said. She's killing infrastructure. There's a difference. Yeah. Butcher looked back at the server, housing the neat stacks, the empty slots, the deliberate organization of something that had taken everything it needed and left the rest arranged in a way that was almost contemptuous in its tidiness. Killing cleanup means you want to erase evidence. She's not erasing evidence. She's taking the architecture and leaving everything else exactly where it was, so whoever comes after knows exactly what she took. Frenchie looked up from his scanner. She wants Vought to know what's missing. She wants them to know what she has. They spent another 40 minutes in the depot, And in that time, Butcher built a picture from the residue, the same way he always built pictures, not by looking for what was there, but by reading the shape of what wasn't. The data she'd taken was the HR-adjacent material. Not operational logistics, not financial records, not the kind of dirt that went to journalists. The files she'd extracted were the ones that connected Vought's black site personnel to their facility assignments, names, clearances, internal org charts, the administrative connective tissue of a shadow infrastructure that had been kept very carefully separated from the parent company's visible organization. "She's not building a case," Huey said when Butcher laid it out. "No." "Then what is she building?" Butcher folded the printout Wells had sent and put it in his jacket. A map of who holds what door. The silence after that had the texture of everyone in the room working out the implications at slightly different speeds. "If she has personnel assignments from the node sites," Mother's Milk said carefully, "she can walk straight to the active facilities. No signal chase, no relay tracking. She already has the addresses." "Which means the rollout just became a liability," Frenchie said. "Every site they move to, she might already know where they went." "Not might, Butcher said. "Does?" Another silence. "So what are they doing?" Huey asked. "Vought right now, what are they doing?" Exactly what she expected. Moving faster, covering harder, pulling more assets into motion. Butcher looked at the neat row of empty server slots one more time before he turned for the door. "Every time they run a new protocol, they signal a new node. Every time they signal a new node, she reads it. The more professional their response, the more detail she gets." He stopped at the bent doorframe and ran his thumb along the compressed metal where the locking bar had been pressed through its housing. The deformation was clean, circular, applied with an exactness that had nothing to do with brute force. "This isn't rage," he said. "This isn't a soup going wrong. This thing is running a campaign." Mother's Milk said from outside, "Butcher." "I know. That's a different category of problem." "I know that too." He stepped through the door into the morning. The lot was empty. The bent fence posts caught the early light and threw thin shadows. Somewhere across the tree line, the cleanup team Vought had dispatched would be 20 minutes away at most. But it's also the only thing I've seen in 6 years that's going after the right targets. "You're going to try to make contact," Mother's Milk said. It wasn't a question. "I'm going to figure out where it's going next." Butcher walked toward the vehicles. "Then I'm going to be there first. And then..." Butcher opened the door of the van. "And then I'm going to find out if it's the kind of thing that can be talked to, or just the kind of thing that can be aimed." Vought's cleanup team reached the depot at 7:48 a.m. They documented the site, bagged the recoverable material, photographed the wall in the back section, and filed a report that described the incident as a security breach by an unidentified super-origin entity, with a damage assessment of low strategic impact pending further investigation. The man who wrote that assessment had not looked at the wall for very long. The report went to Brannigan. Brannigan forwarded it to Edgar with one line appended, "Third site. Consistent methodology. She knows which sites are active." Edgar read it at 8:15 and did not respond, which was his version of the same acknowledgement. He pulled up the internal map of active rollout destinations. 14 sites, all repositioned, all running on new routing. He had changed the methodology after Transport 7. He had assumed the new channels were clean. He looked at the timeline of the depot breach, which had occurred between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m., before the new routing was active, which meant she had accessed the depot using personnel data from before the rollout, which meant she had extracted org chart files from somewhere upstream. He pulled up the Facility 9 terminal access log, the sub-level 3 backup chain Brannigan had flagged as possibly breached. He stared at it for a while. Then he opened a new document and began mapping the intersection between what she demonstrably had and what she could now reach with it. It took him 22 minutes. When he finished the list of facilities she could walk directly to without any further signal tracking was longer than he would have preferred to tell anyone. He did not update the briefing. He did not call Homelander. He opened his desk drawer and took out the second phone. No, Starlight heard about the depot through a source inside Vought's facilities compliance division. A middle manager named Chen, who had been quietly passing her information for 4 months, and who had called her that morning in a state that she could only describe as specifically not panicked, the way people sound when they have decided that panic is a luxury they cannot afford right now. "Third one in 36 hours, Chen said. "And this one's different. The security team, the way they described the scene." He stopped. "What about the scene? They said it looked like the building had a conversation with someone and lost." Starlight had heard stranger things in her time at Vought. She had seen the inside of 2 black sites, had read enough internal documentation to understand that the organization she worked for was capable of things that had no clean category. She did not shock easily. She sat with Chen's description for a while after she ended the call. A conversation the building had lost. She thought about the footage fragments that had started circulating inside Vought's internal security channels, blurry, degraded, clearly pulled from secondary systems that had survived whatever had happened at Facility 9. She had seen 30 seconds of it before the access had been revoked. A figure walking down a corridor. Security firing. The rounds stopping. The corridor itself becoming something else. She thought about 3 security personnel in a depot, and one of them 6 inches off the ground. She thought about the files she had been quietly building on Vought's black site activity, which she had been told twice to stop building and had not stopped building. Whatever was out there, it was going after the same things she had been trying to reach from the inside for 2 years. That was not the same as it being good, but it was in a way she didn't fully want to examine almost exactly what she had asked for. By noon, Butcher had maps on 4 walls, and Frenchie had pulled enough open-source signal data to triangulate the last 3 incident sites against the rollout routing anomalies Wells had flagged. The pattern was very clean, almost insultingly clean once you had the right frame. "It's not going to the sites randomly," Frenchie said, moving pins on the board. "Look at the sequence. First the relay node hit, then the convoy, then the depot. Each one is a layer deeper into the org." "It's peeling," Huey said. Everyone looked at him, like peeling an onion. Outside first, then the layer under that, then... He stopped. "You know what I mean?" "Yeah," Butcher said. He was looking at the map with a particular focus that meant he'd found the shape of something. Outer layer is signals and logistics. Middle layer is data and personnel files. Inner layer is active facilities. Mother's milk finished. Active facilities, as Butcher put his finger on a point on the map east of the Blue Ridge. Wells flagged this one as a live subject site, highest priority in the rollout. They moved it first. He moved his finger slightly north. But if she has the personnel files from the depot, she already knows where it moved to. The room was quiet for a moment. "That's where she's going next," Huey said. "That's where she's going next." Butcher stepped back from the map. "And that's where we're going to be," Mother's Milk said carefully. "To do what exactly?" Butcher picked up his jacket. "To watch, and to be there when she finds out what's inside, because whatever Vought put in that facility is exactly the kind of thing that tends to make the news in the worst possible way. And if she decides we're in the way..." Butcher looked at the wall, at the pins. at the clean, almost mathematical arc of 3 sights moving inward toward something Vought was very afraid to have found. "Then we get out of the way very fast," he said. "And we don't make the kind of noise that sounds like a target." The facility had a name in Vought's internal documentation, Site 11, but the personnel who worked there had stopped using it within the first year of operation. They called it the Kennel. Not on any official form. Not in any report that went above sub-director level. Just between themselves in the break room that smelled of recycled air and burnt coffee, while they processed the paperwork that described human beings as asset units with intake numbers and condition grades. It sat 3 levels below a former industrial cooling complex outside Frederick, self-sufficient climate-controlled nominally a pharmaceutical compliance site belonging to a shell company with an unremarkable address. The real purpose was what it had always been, a place where Vought sent the things it could not use and could not afford to let speak. Sub-level 2 held 23 individuals. 7 adults with compound V effects too unstable for program deployment, enrolled in enhancement trials, without the vocabulary to understand what consent meant in this context, and afterward a liability with a pulse. 11 adolescents from the youth cohort, 5 children. The housing units were very clean. Vought had found through legal counsel that the most defensible position in the event of an unforeseen discovery was a documented standard of care. The floors were swept. The walls were white. Each unit had a bed, a toilet, a fluorescent strip that ran on a timer. The intake wristbands were color-coded. The condition grades were updated every 72 hours by a physician's assistant who had signed an NDA running to 40 pages and who no longer made eye contact with the occupants during assessments. The site's primary data archive, personnel histories compound 5 trial records. Outcome documentation was on sub-level 3 behind a biometric lock and a secondary keypad in a room that was kept at a different temperature than the rest of the facility. Kerrigan came through the surface access point at 2 a.m. The security detail on overnight rotation was 8 personnel distributed across 3 posts. The site commander, a former federal contractor named Holt, who had worked black sites in 2 different countries before Vought had been briefed on the Facility 9 incident, and had spent the prior 48 hours implementing what he considered significant countermeasures. He had tripled the corridor's sensor density. He had added a psionic dampening array prototype hardware, borrowed from a Vought R&D division designed to interrupt focused energy outputs above a certain threshold. He had also requested backup from the regional rapid response team and been denied because the rollout had the regional assets committed elsewhere. The dampening array registered an anomalous reading at 2:04 a.m. and then stopped functioning at 2:04 a.m. and 14 seconds. Holt was at the monitoring station on sub-level 1 when the first corridor feed went dark. He ran the standard response sequence lockdown initiation, all-channel alert, backup post-activation. The lockdown doors on sub-level 1 sealed. The ones on sub-level 2 sealed. The one on sub-level 3 sealed, held for approximately 2 seconds, and then separated from its frame and moved 4 feet down the corridor on its own, traveling in a direction that was not the direction doors moved, scraping a channel in the concrete floor. He heard the second post stop, responding at 2:07. She moved through sub-level 1 with the building's floor plan, already understood the personnel file archive from the Manassas Depot had included Site 11's structural schematics filed with an environmental compliance agency under the cold storage cover identity, pulled from a database she had accessed through the facility's own outbound maintenance log. She had read it before she arrived. She knew where the power junctions were. She knew the sensor grid. She knew which 3 corridors led to the primary data room and which one of those had a load-bearing wall she could use to collapse the secondary security post without touching the data infrastructure behind it. The first security team encountered her in Corridor C on sub-level 1. 4 men, full tactical, a directed energy disruptor on the team lead's left shoulder that represented Vaught's best current attempt at a non-kinetic countermeasure. The disruptor fired. The charge left the emitter, traveled approximately 8 inches, and encountered something that was not the air it expected to pass through. It did not reflect. It did not dissipate. It arrived back at the emitter, housing from the inside, and the housing came apart at the seams from internal pressure, and the team lead sat down very hard on the floor, holding what was left of his shoulder mount and breathing in short, shallow increments. The other 3 had a second and a half to act, which was enough time to fire and not enough time for it to matter. The round stopped. The corridor compressed, not the walls, not the ceiling, just the air between them and her thickening and tightening in a way that had no physical vocabulary that the human nervous system recognized as wrong before the brain could name it. One man went into the wall on his left, pressed there by something that distributed the force across his entire body, simultaneously holding him with the specific precision of a grip that knew exactly where the skeleton was and was choosing not to break it. Yet, the other 2 were turned and walked, not thrown, not dragged, but moved their own legs, carrying them, as the thing directing those legs steered them into the side corridor and left them standing there, facing the wall, while she passed. She left the team lead on the floor. His disruptor was rubble. He was not. Sub-level 1's junction box lasted slightly longer than the team. She reached it at 2:09, pressed 2 fingers against the housing, and sent something inward that found the psionic dampening relay, specifically traveled through the circuit architecture until it located the component responsible and fused it from the inside out in a pulse that took less than a second and left everything else in the junction intact. The lights stayed on. The cameras stayed on. She left the cameras on. Sub-level 2 opened at 2:11. Bonk. The doors came apart at the hinges, all 23 of them, in a sequence that moved down the corridor like a slow wave. Not explosive, not violent. Each door simply stopped being attached to its frame and eased open the electromagnetic locks, releasing not because the power was cut, but because the mechanism itself was being addressed directly, each one in turn, with the patience of something that had done more complicated things in less time and saw no reason to hurry. The corridor was silent for 4 seconds after the last door opened. Nobody came out. Holt, watching on the remaining camera feeds from the monitoring station, saw the doors open and saw the occupants of the units do what people do when a locked door opens at 2 in the morning. In a place they have learned to distrust completely, they stayed where they were. They stood back. Some of them moved to the far wall. The children went still in the particular way that children go still when they have learned that visible reaction is not safe. One of the adults, a man with the compound V intake wristband coded yellow meaning partial manifestation instability, flagged, stepped to his doorway and looked down the empty corridor. He looked for a long time. Then he stepped back into his unit and sat on his bed. In the unit 3 doors down, a girl who was 11 years old and had been inside for 14 months stood at the back wall with her arms wrapped around herself and did not move toward the open door. Because she had learned in 14 months that when things opened unexpectedly, it was usually because something worse was about to happen. Holt had been in this business long enough to understand that the doors were not opened for the occupants. They were opened so that Vought, watching on whatever feed survived, would have to look at what was inside them while Kerrigan stripped the data room below. He picked up his emergency line to the sub-director. "We have a breach on all 3 sub-levels," he said. "Site 11 is compromised. I need evacuation authorization for the asset housing units immediately." The sub-director said, "I need to run that through compliance." Holt looked at his cameras, at 23 open doors, at the people inside them, who had been in there for months or years waiting for a company to decide whether they were worth keeping. "Run it fast," he said. On to Sub-Level 3 took 6 minutes. The biometric lock did not slow her. The secondary keypad did not slow her. The reinforced door to the data room, 18-gauge steel rated for blast resistance, took approximately 4 seconds to address, and she addressed it by locating the structural weak points in the frame, rather than the door itself applying focused force to each one in sequence, until the frame pulled free of the wall and then walking through the resulting gap with the door still nominally in place, just no longer connected to anything. The data room was exactly what the schematic said. It was floor-to-ceiling archive drives, 3 active terminals, a cold storage cabinet containing biological samples, and a filing system that organized human beings by program code and outcome category. She worked through it systematically. The drives she wanted trial records intake documentation, the paper trail connecting Site 11's population to Vought's parent corporate chain she extracted. One of the active terminals had a dead man alert hardwired to an uplink she hadn't flagged in the schematics. It triggered the moment she touched the primary housing. She hit it with a single focused burst, not a push, not a compression, but a direct psionic strike that traveled the length of her arm and hit the terminal's uplink board in a point roughly the size of a fingertip, burning through every active component in a straight line from entry to housing wall. The terminal went dark. The alert did not complete. The surrounding equipment was untouched. The rest she destroyed from the inside, leaving physical housings intact. But contents reduced to nothing recoverable because she had no interest in giving Vought the comfort of having something to reconstruct. The biological sample cabinet she did not touch. She left it sealed. She was back at the surface access point at 2:19, 18 minutes from entry to exit. Starlight got the call at 4 a.m. from Vaught's head of internal communications, who used the phrase significant asset management incident at one of our compliance testing facilities, and then gave her a location and asked her to go there because the regional team was unavailable and she was the 7-member closest to Frederick. She drove there because she was still at 4 a.m., operating on the assumption that her presence at events like this was useful, that bearing witness was a thing that mattered, that going was better than not going. She was there by 5:30. The sun was just coming up. A Vought security team was already on site with a cleanup protocol running, which meant vehicles, tarps, personnel in unmarked tactical gear moving quickly and quietly through the access road. The sub-director met her at the perimeter. His name was Gareth. He had the face of a man who had been making bad decisions for so long that the face had reorganized itself around the weight of them. "We're handling it," he said. "What happened?" "Asset management incident." What kind of facility is this?" A pause that was 1 beat too long. "Compliance testing." Starlight looked past him at the access road, at the tarps, at the personnel moving with the specific speed of people cleaning something that needed to not be visible before daylight fully arrived. "I want to go inside." "That's not..." "I'm a member of the 7. I'm here on Vaught's request. I'm going inside." He let her through because the alternative was an argument that would itself become a record, and Gareth was the kind of man who understood that argument records were worse than the thing you were trying to prevent people from arguing about. Sub-level 2 smelled like industrial cleaner over something that the cleaner wasn't quite strong enough to replace. The fluorescent strips ran their cold light down a corridor of open doors. The cleanup team had been through and the housing units were empty. The occupants had been moved to transport vehicles in the parking structure above which was a thing that made Starlight's chest do something that didn't have a clean name. She stood in the corridor and looked at the doors, at the wristband dispensers mounted by each frame, at the color-coded intake system, at the condition grade chart on the wall near the security station, which someone had not yet removed, which listed 23 codes and 23 grade assessments and 23 23 last updated timestamps. 11 of the codes were prefixed with the letter Y. She knew what Y meant. She had been in the program long enough to know what Y meant. She stood there for a while. The cleanup team moved around her. Nobody said anything to her. One of them made brief eye contact and then looked away in the manner of someone who had decided that the most defensible position was to have not seen her there. She took photos with her phone, not because she had a plan, because it was the only action available to her in that moment that felt like it had any weight at all. On the way out, she passed Gareth in the stairwell. "Who knew this was here?" she said. He looked at the wall beside her head. "The relevant parties." "How long?" "The facility has been operational for..." "How long have there been children in there?" He didn't answer, which was, she understood, the only honest answer he had. She walked past him. Outside, the sun was up now. The parking structure transport vehicles were pulling away. She stood in the access road and watched them go, and understood with a clarity that felt like something breaking, rather than something becoming clear that the organization she had worked for had not gone wrong at any specific point. It had been built to do this. The structure that produced the endorsement deals and the charity events and the Vought Plus streaming content was the same structure that produced the color-coded wristbands and the condition grades and the children in the units with the fluorescent timers. It wasn't rot. It was architecture. Her phone buzzed. It was Ashley wanting a statement for the morning cycle. She put the phone in her pocket and walked to her car. By noon, two things had happened that Vought's Narrative Control Division had not been able to prevent. The first was a 3-second clip captured on a personal device by a motorist who had pulled over near the Site 11 access road at approximately 5:45 a.m. and filmed what appeared to be unmarked security vehicles, removing people from an unmarked facility, including at least 2 individuals small enough to be children. The clip was on 4 platforms before Vought's digital response team was even aware it existed. The second was a blurry still image, provenance unclear, showing what appeared to be a corridor of vacant stores in an institutional setting. It was not identifiable as Site 11 specifically, but it was identifiable as a corridor of doors, and the doors were open, and the wristband dispensers were visible, and people who had been following the strange Vought press releases about biological anomaly activity for 3 days had begun assembling these fragments into a shape that Vought's PR architecture had been specifically designed to prevent anyone from assembling. Ashley was on her 7th call of the morning when she looked at her monitoring dashboard and saw the trajectory and said to no one in particular, "We are so completely..." She didn't finish the sentence. She started a new call. Edgar received the social media report at 12:30 and read it for 4 minutes. Then he called the head of the 7's operational team. "I need them visible," he said. "Not a statement. Visible. Something public-facing, something that reminds people what the brand is." He paused. "Something that requires them to go somewhere and be seen dealing with a threat." The operational team head said. "What threat?" Edgar looked at his window. "Find one," he said, "or use the real one. Carefully." He set the phone down. Outside, the city was doing its usual thing. Inside, somewhere in his building, Ashley was making calls that were buying hours, not days. Across town, Homelander had almost certainly already seen the clip. Edgar had managed assets for 26 years. He had navigated crises that would have destroyed organizations less carefully constructed than Vought. He had always operated from the position that information was controllable, that narrative was a resource like any other, that given sufficient leverage and sufficient speed, any event could be framed into something survivable. He was beginning to understand that the current event had a different relationship with information than anything he had managed before. It was not leaking data. It was not exposing secrets. It was selecting what to leave visible and what to destroy. And the selection was designed to produce exactly the chain of reactions currently running through every media platform and government monitoring system that had Vought flagged. The exposure was not incidental. It was the objective. He opened the desk drawer. He took out the second phone. This time it rang twice before the other end picked up, and what he said into it was not the kind of thing he said on the phone that lived in his pocket. Vaught's distribution hub outside Newark had been chosen because it ticked every box on Ashley's crisis deployment checklist, close enough to a major metro for fast media response, large enough to stage a visible operation, branded enough that any footage coming out of it would look like Vought controlling the situation rather than reacting to one. The signage was clean. The parking lot was the size of 3 football fields. There was a Vought logo on the water tower that was visible from the interstate, which Ashley had noted in her briefing memo as an asset. The 7 arrived at 4 p.m. via a staggered deployment designed to look like coordinated response. A train first because he was fast, and his arrival would register on traffic cameras along 3 separate routes and generate the kind of ambient media presence that didn't require a press release. Black Noir shortly after, because he was quiet, and his presence at the perimeter kept the security detail's confidence up. Then the others. The Deep 2 secondary members whose names varied depending on current roster. Each arrival logged and time-stamped and fed to the monitoring team Ashley had stationed in the media vehicle parked at the lot's northwest corner. The monitoring team's job was to track what cameras were running, where civilian phones were pointed, and which angles showed the 7, looking like they had the situation under control. She had also, at Edgar's specific direction, instructed the security detail to keep a 200-meter exclusion zone around the northeast quadrant of the property. That was where the signal trace had put the next likely incursion point. A-Train found her first, because that was what he did. He moved faster than anything else in the zip code, and he had spent 6 years treating that fact as an argument that he won every encounter before it started. He came in from the east at full sprint, which at his velocity meant the moment between being outside the building and being inside it was not meaningfully measurable. He hit the psionic field at approximately the 3rd row of shelving. He did not go through it. He did not slow down and recalibrate. He simply stopped, his momentum absorbed by something that was not a wall and not a person and had no visible surface stopping him with the same lack of drama as water stopping a match. The impact traveled backwards through his body in a sequence his skeleton was not designed to experience, starting at his outstretched right arm and moving inward, and the sounds his forearm and shoulder made in the half-second of deceleration were not the sounds of a speedster pulling up short. He went down between the shelves and did not immediately get back up. She had not turned to watch him arrive. Black Noir entered from the roof. Access on the north side, which was the correct tactical choice, high-entry shadow movement approach from an angle that put ambient light in the target's eyes. He moved across the upper catwalks, with the particular economy of someone for whom stealth was not a technique, but a default state. He reached the midpoint catwalk directly above her position and crouched there for 4 seconds assessing. 4 seconds was longer than he needed and shorter than he would have liked. She looked up, not at the catwalk, through it. The way you look at a thing when the physical surface of it is not actually what you're reading. He dropped anyway because dropping was the right call, and he had survived a long time by making right calls in bad situations. He was good. He was within the system he'd been built for, exceptional. He hit the floor in a controlled landing with a blade already moving. The blade stopped 8 inches from her. Not deflected, not blocked by a raised arm. The blade stopped because the arm holding it stopped every muscle from his shoulder to his wrist, locked simultaneously, held with the same distributed and implacable force that had no point of origin he could locate or push against. He had trained against 100 types of restraint. He had broken most of them. This one did not have leverage points. It had no seams. It was simply the difference between a body that was deciding its own movements and a body that had been informed it no longer had that option. She turned and looked at him the way she had looked at Galvin on the highway shoulder. Filing, assessing, moving on. She closed the grip incrementally, not enough to shatter enough to communicate. His forearm bent at an angle. Forearms did not bend under normal circumstances. Then she released him, turned and walked toward the archive loading bay at the back of the facility. He did not follow. Ashley watched all of this on the monitoring feed and said a word she had promised herself she would stop saying, and then said it again. "Get me angle 4, she said to the technician. Angle 4 only. That's the one that shows the parking lot and the signage, not the... She stopped. The interior feed from camera 7 was still running, which meant whatever was in there had not destroyed the cameras, which meant there was footage of Black Noir on the floor holding his arm, an A-train on his back between the shelves. And that footage existed on Vought servers and possibly on whatever the camera feeds routed through. And she needed to find out exactly where it routed before anyone else did. "Pull the internal feeds," she said. "All of them. Server side right now before anyone." Her phone buzzed. It was the head of legal. She answered it, and he did not say hello. He said, "The interior cameras are on an external logging service." She closed her eyes for approximately 1 second. "Which one?" "ComSec Solutions. They have automatic cloud backup on a 4-minute lag." "Can we pull it?" "We can flag it. They have a 22-minute response window on emergency redaction requests." "How long has this been running?" 11 minutes. She opened her eyes. On the monitor in front of her, angle 4 showed the Vought water tower logo, clean against the late afternoon sky, utterly unaware of what was happening 90 meters to its right. "Make the call," she said, "and get me Homelander." The Deep was outside with the secondary members when the northeast wall of the facility came apart. Not exploded, came apart. The panels separated from the structural frame as if the building had been informed that this particular section of itself was no longer architecturally necessary, and each piece moved away from its mounting with a deliberateness that was worse than explosion. Because explosion was chaotic, and this was not. The secondary members ran. The Deep, to his credit or his poor judgment, stepped toward it. A section of roof panel caught him in the chest and put him through the fence at the lot's perimeter. He was technically still on Vought property. He was also technically no longer relevant to the engagement. From the monitoring vehicle, Ashley watched the water tower logo sway very slightly in the shockwave hold and then go still. The Vought signage remained intact. Everything below it was a different question. She came through the breach in the wall and stopped. The parking lot was large and flat and lit by the late sun from the west. And there were 4 camera drones that the monitoring team had launched to maintain coverage, and there was a news helicopter that had been following the police scanner traffic from Newark and had found the exclusion zone and was now holding position at the legal flight ceiling directly above. There were approximately 30 civilians who had been in the lot for various mundane purposes and who had not evacuated because humans, when presented with something extraordinary, tended to stop and look at it rather than run from it. The biological extensions along her upper back spread slightly, adjusting the way a predator's posture shifts when it moves from enclosed space to open ground. She stood in the gap she had made in the wall and looked at the lot, the drones, the helicopter, the people with their phones pointed at her. She did not look concerned. Behind her inside the facility, the archive loading bay was already processed. The drives she had come for were already gone. She had what she needed. What remained was optional. The 4 security personnel who had stayed at their posts in the lot came toward her in a configured line, which was the right tactical formation and would have been meaningful against almost anything else on the property. She raised one hand. Not a dramatic gesture. She raised it the way you raise a hand to indicate that something is about to stop, and the security line stopped. Each of them held in place by the same omnidirectional pressure that had no walls and no ceiling and made resistance feel like arguing with gravity. She walked past them and left them standing. The drones she took down with 4 focused pulses in 4 seconds each one, a single compressed burst that hit the propulsion systems and turned them off permanently. Not the cameras. She left the camera housings intact and falling toward the asphalt with their lenses still running. She looked up at the news helicopter. She let it watch. Homelander got the external feed at 4:47 p.m. through the same internal contact who had told him about Facility 9, and he watched it with the specific quality of attention he reserved for things that required him not to do what he immediately wanted to do. A-Train was at a hospital. Black Noir had been extracted by the security team, and his arm was a reconstructive surgery problem. The Deep had a concussion and a fence post impression across his rib cage, and had not stopped talking to his publicist's assistant. 2 secondary 7 members had run. The water tower logo was on every platform. Not the Fight the Water Tower visible in the background of the Angle 4 feed, recognizable branded, while in the same shot the parking lot fence lay in sections, and the drones were in pieces on the asphalt, and the security detail stood frozen in a line like very expensive garden ornaments. Someone on a social platform with 400,000 followers had already captioned it their best and ours. Spot the difference. Homelander set his phone down. He picked it up again. He set it down. Edgar called at 4:53. "I saw it," Homelander said before Edgar could speak. "I know. You sent them without me. The calculus at the time, you sent them without me, and they went down like furniture." His voice was doing the thing it did when the version of him that was good at resetting had stopped trying. A-Train has a broken arm. Black Noir is in surgery. You put our brand in front of something and it made our brand look like a joke, and you did that without me in the frame. Homelander, send me the location. A pause. "That's not the current operational recommendation," Edgar said. "Send me the location." Another pause. Longer. Edgar was doing math on the other end of that pause. Homelander could hear. It could feel the weight of the calculation. The exact sound of a man deciding which loss was more manageable. "I'll have it to you within the hour," Edgar said. "But not public, not a statement. If you go smart." "I go however I want," Homelander said. "And she better still be where I can find her." He ended the call and looked at his phone. At the water tower clip. At the caption someone had written under it. He threw the phone through the window. The window was rated for impact resistance, up to the standards required by the building code, applicable to structures housing significant corporate assets. It did not meet the standard applicable to Homelander. Butcher watched the external feed from the van outside the lot's south perimeter and did not say anything for 45 seconds after it ended. Frenchie was the one who finally spoke. "That was," he said, and stopped and tried again. "That was a very bad day to be a logo." Mother's Milk said, "She didn't even take long." 14 minutes from breach to exit, Huey said, reading from the scanner log. "She was in there for under 14 minutes, and 3 members of the 7 are in medical." Butcher looked at the lot, at the fence, at the frozen security detail still being walked through unfreeze procedures by the response team. At angle 4 of the Vought feed, which he had also been watching, where the water tower logo stood undamaged and self-serious over the wreckage of the company's most public assets. She left the cameras, he said. Yeah, Mother's Milk said. She left the news helicopter. Yeah. Butcher turned away from the window. She knew they were there before she came through the wall. She took down the drones, the company cameras, and left everything else running. He sat back in his seat. She wanted the public footage. She didn't want Vaught's version. She wanted the version where every civilian phone and every news outfit sees the 7 on the ground. The van was quiet for a moment. She's not just taking their data, Huey said slowly. She's taking their story. Yeah, Butcher said. He looked at his hands. At 6 years of grinding this fight at ground level through Compound 5, and lawyers, and black site leaks, and operations that ended in body bags more often than they ended in anything worth celebrating. She's not just going after what they built. She's going after the thing that lets them keep building it. He looked at the water tower logo one more time. Tell me everything we know about where she goes next, he said. Menengs, he said. Because wherever that is, I'm going to be standing there before she arrives. And this time, I'm going to talk to her. The clip ran for 37 seconds. Not the fight there hadn't been much fight to speak of, which was precisely the problem. 37 seconds of the northeast wall of a Vought distribution hub separating from its frame, and then a figure walking through the gap. And then the security detail in the parking lot going still as statues. And then 4 camera drones falling out of the sky in 4 seconds. Like someone had swatted them, and then the figure looking up at the news helicopter and letting it look back. That was the part people kept watching. The last 4 seconds before she turned and walked away. The helicopter feed had caught her face in enough resolution to be identifiable as a face. And the thing people kept stopping on the thing that had already been screenshotted 8,000 times by midnight was not the biological extensions behind her shoulders or the way the security team stood locked in place. It was the look. The complete untroubled absence of concern. The expression of something that had considered the helicopter's presence and decided it was not interesting. By 11 p.m. The clip had 82 million views across 6 platforms, for 2 of which had declined Vaught's request to reduce algorithmic amplification on grounds of newsworthiness. In the media vehicle outside the Newark lot, Ashley had watched the view counter climb for 6 hours and said very little. So, the Vought board convened an emergency call at 9 a.m. the following morning. Edgar ran it. He had 11 slides and used 3 of them. The situation as he presented it had 3 components. The first was physical 6 confirmed facility losses, 4 personnel fatalities across all incidents, 3. 7 members in medical care, 1 of those requiring reconstruction surgery. The second was informational, an estimated partial to substantial breach of the Black Site personnel database, meaning an unknown volume of operational documentation was in the possession of the incursion entity. The third was perceptual, which was the one that made the board sit differently in their chairs. The 7 engagement yesterday was recorded by 14 civilian devices and 1 news outlet, Edgar said. Our internal feeds were partially preserved through the ComSec logging service before our emergency redaction request was processed. We were outside our 22-minute window. The external footage is distributed and unrecoverable. Someone on the call said, "Is there a path to suppression?" "No," Edgar said. "There is a path to narrative management. That path requires Homelander to make a public statement within 24 hours that reframes the engagement as a deliberate tactical withdrawal rather than a defeat. It requires A-Train and Black Noir to be visible and functional within 72 hours. It requires us to introduce a credible external threat narrative that makes the incursion entity look like a danger to civilians rather than a danger to Vought specifically." He paused. None of those paths are currently viable. The board member who had asked about suppression said, "Why not?" "Because she left the cameras running," Edgar said. She destroyed ours. She left the public ones. That is not an accident. It is a choice about who controls the record. He closed his laptop. We are no longer managing a security incident, he said. We are managing a public narrative in which the other party has better assets than we do. The call was quiet for a moment, in a way that Edgar recognized as the sound of very expensive people trying to understand how they had arrived somewhere they'd never prepared for. Homelander had not slept. Not because he couldn't. He didn't need sleep the way human beings needed sleep. And the distinction had always made him feel the correctness of the gap between himself and everyone else. He hadn't slept because sleeping required lying still. And lying still meant not doing the thing he had spent 12 hours restraining himself from doing, which was flying to Newark and finding the thing that had walked out of his company's wall, and looking at it from close enough range to make certain that his previous assessment of the situation, that there was nothing in this world he couldn't end, was still accurate. He was almost certain it was still accurate. He stood at the window of his residential floor at Vought Tower and watched the city operate below him and thought about the clip, about the 37 seconds, about the 4 seconds at the end. The clip had a comment, not one comment, hundreds of thousands of them, but one in particular that he'd found at 3 a.m. by scrolling through the footage frame by frame, in the specific way he did things when no one was watching. And it said she didn't even hurry. He had closed the app and put the phone face down on the kitchen counter. She hadn't hurried. He had spent his entire visible career being the thing that other things hurried away from. He had spent 6 years making sure the gap between his presence and everyone else's reaction was always measured in seconds of fear. And the thing in that clip had come through a wall, processed a parking lot full of his colleagues, looked at a news helicopter, and walked away with the same pace you used to cross a room to get a glass of water. His phone buzzed. It was the head of his personal communications team, which meant it was something he was supposed to be doing publicly. He let it buzz, a second buzz, a third, then the direct line, the one reserved for Edgar's calls, and the 2 or 3 other people who were allowed to use it. He picked up. It was not Edgar. "We have a situation," said the woman on the other end, whose name was Cassidy, and who ran Homelander's independent intelligence operation out of an office in Chelsea that didn't appear on any Vought org chart. Someone leaked the black site personnel files. Not all of them, partial release posted to a document hosting platform under a pseudonym at 6 this morning. It's been downloaded 60,000 times. Legal is working on a takedown, but it's already been mirrored. Homelander said nothing. "The files include names," Cassidy said. "Staff assignments, facility addresses partially redacted, program classification codes." A pause. "Some of it links back to personnel who currently work at the tower." "Which personnel?" "Sub-director level and above. 7 people. 2 of them are on the floor below you right now." Homelander looked at the floor. Not metaphorically, he looked down through it with the vision that let him see the structure and the heat signatures and the people inside 2 floors down in the communications hub that ran around the clock, whether he was paying attention or not. "She gave that to someone," he said. "The files. We don't know that." "She gave them to someone and they posted them this morning because she timed it." His voice was very even. "She's been building this since Facility 9. Every breach has been timed." "That's one interpretation. Get me the leak source." "We're working on get me the source." He set the phone on the counter with the same deliberate care as the night before and stood there for a moment. Then he turned and walked to the elevator and pressed the subfloor button and rode it down 2 levels and walked through the door of the communications hub without knocking. The 7 people in the room went still. He looked at all of them. They looked back at him with the range of expressions that people produced. When Homelander walked into a room unannounced, which covered the distance between professionally composed and quietly terrified. "Which one of you," he said in the voice that sounded like the weather about to do something, "has been on this floor for less than 3 months?" Nobody answered. "I'll ask again," he said, "and after that, I'll stop asking." The woman at the far left console raised her hand. She was 28. Her name was Devereaux. She had been hired 6 weeks ago as a data routing specialist, which was a real job she actually did, and her background check had been thorough by the standards of Vought's HR division, which were good standards that had not been designed to catch the kind of person who had been placed there with a specific purpose. She said, "I don't know what—" "Step away from the console," Homelander said. She did. He could hear her heartbeat do something irregular, and underneath the irregular heartbeat, he could hear the specific quality of controlled fear that wasn't just surprise, the kind that came from someone who had understood for weeks that this moment was coming, and had prepared for it, and was discovering that preparation didn't feel the way they'd thought it would. He walked toward her. The 6 other people in the room made a collective and entirely silent decision about whether to intervene, and arrived at the conclusion that they would not, which was the correct conclusion, and they would all carry the weight of it for the rest of their lives. Date: the body was found at noon. Vought had a protocol for this internal incident building security discreet removal. Medical examiner on retainer who had signed the right documents. It ran smoothly because it had run before. Ashley got the notification at 12:15 and sat with it for a moment. Then she opened a new document and began drafting the cover story for the disappearance of a Vought communications employee, and she was halfway through it when she stopped and sat back and looked at the ceiling. She had written a lot of these. She had written them for people she had known and people she hadn't, and people who had done things that warranted them and people who hadn't, she had written them because that was the job. And the job had always felt like something she could keep separated from the part of herself that remembered why she'd wanted to work in media in the first place. She was finding that separation harder to locate than usual. She finished the document. She sent it. She opened the clip again and watched the last 4 seconds. Starlight heard about Devereaux through a source who had been 3 floors down and had seen the aftermath before the building security team arrived. Her source didn't use names, she just said what she'd seen in a voice that had the particular flatness of someone who had decided that flat was the only register that didn't involve breaking down. Starlight sat in her car in the tower parking garage and thought about the corridor at Site 11 and the chart on the wall and the letter Y. She thought about Homelander and the communications hub. And she thought about what Vought had been doing to people for years, before any of this started, and she thought about the clip with 82 million views. She thought about the gap between those two things. A cataclysm was happening, and it was destroying the right structures. But the structures didn't fall clean. They fell on everything underneath them, and underneath them were people who hadn't built them and couldn't get out from under them fast enough. And she didn't know how to hold both of those things in her head at the same time, without something in the middle giving way. She took out her phone. She had 312 unread messages from Vought Communications. She had a statement draft out waiting for her approval about the Newark engagement, which described it as a coordinated tactical exercise responding to an uncontrolled superorigin entity, and which she was supposed to publish by 3 p.m. She did not open the draft. She opened the photos she had taken at Site 11 instead and looked at them for a long time. The intake chart, the wristband dispensers, the open doors. Then she sent all of them to a reporter she had been in cautious contact with for 8 months, whose name she was not going to say out loud, and put her phone in her bag and sat in the garage for another 10 minutes before she could make herself drive. Butcher found the partial file release at 7 that morning before most of the coverage had caught up to it. He read it in the van while Mother's Milk drove, and Frenchie and Huey were still running the scanner data from the night before. The files were partial redacted in irregular places and structured in a way that suggested they had not been leaked by someone who had the complete picture, but by someone who had the complete picture and had chosen very carefully which parts to release. The redacted sections weren't random. They were strategic enough to be scandalous, not enough to fully expose the deepest layer of the infrastructure. A breadcrumb, not an accident, a choice. "She's using the files as a weapon separate from having the files," he said to no one in particular. "Who is?" Huey asked. "Kerrigan." Butcher said the name for the first time. He'd been using it and this thing, and whatever this is, for 3 days, which was the appropriate linguistic response to something you didn't fully understand and couldn't categorize. But after Newark, after watching the water tower clip 12 times, after reading the partial file release, he had a frame. Not a complete one, but enough. "Her name is Kerrigan. She's not from here. And she is the most tactically intelligent thing I have ever seen operate against Vought." Mother's Milk looked at him in the rear view. "How do you know her name?" "Because I know someone who knows someone who spent a significant amount of time trying to figure out what Vought had in that Virginia facility." Butcher folded the printed files and put them in his jacket. The name was in a recovery team debrief that got buried in 2019. They found her in Nevada, not a lab, not a manufactured subject. Something that arrived. He paused. "The file says unknown origin. That's the whole file. 3 words. Frenchie said quietly. "Unknown origin, and she just took Newark apart in 14 minutes. "Yeah." Butcher looked out the window. The city was doing its morning thing, traffic light, the ordinary operations of a place that hadn't figured out yet that several of the things holding it up were cracking. She's been timed from the beginning. Every breach, every file drop, every piece of footage she left running. She's not reacting to Vought. She's making Vought react to her, and she's using those reactions to pull the next layer into view. He was quiet for a moment. "She doesn't need us. She doesn't need anyone. She will take this company apart by herself if we leave her alone." Mother's Milk said, "So we leave her alone?" "No." Butcher turned from the window. "We find her before she takes the next piece. Not to stop her. To tell her where Homelander is going to be standing when she gets to the part that matters. And she just listens to that. She listens to anything that saves her time," Butcher said. "She's efficient. Efficient things use good information when it's offered." He picked up the scanner. "Find me where she's going next." Homelander posted a statement at 6 p.m. It was 7 sentences long and described the Newark situation as an ongoing tactical engagement with an entity currently being assessed by Vaught's enhanced response teams. It expressed confidence in the Seven's ability to address this threat with the full force of our capabilities. It ended with the line, "America is safe. It always is." The statement received 90,000 comments in 40 minutes. The top comment said, "Bro, your guys got put through a wall, and you were where exactly?" He read that comment 14 times. At 6:47 p.m., he called the number of a person whose name did not appear in any Vought organizational structure and said 4 words. "Where is she now?" The answer was a location he recognized. A distribution point for one of Vaught's most publicly visible logistics operations, the kind of facility that appeared in the supply chain documentation that Vought published annually to demonstrate corporate transparency. The kind of facility that would be very visible if something happened to it. He flew out of Vought Tower at 6:51 p.m. without telling Edgar, without a team, without a plan, beyond the need to be where this was happening and to be the center of it, which was at its core the only plan Homelander had ever had. He came in from the north at 7:04 p.m., dropping out of the cloud cover over Midtown at a speed that made the sound arrive after the shadow. And he landed in the intersection of 48th and 6th with the specific theatrical force of someone who had been doing this long enough to know exactly how much impact the asphalt needed to absorb before people looked up. They looked up. 6 blocks in every direction, foot traffic stopped. Phones came out. The news helicopter that had been tracking the police scanner chatter since the bulletin about a super origin incident pulled northeast toward the intersection and held. A CNN crew that had been 17 blocks away got there in 4 minutes. A woman in a coffee shop on 47th looked at the sound of the impact and picked up her phone and started recording. And 14 seconds into the recording, she had already decided not to run, which was not the rational decision, but rational had been in increasingly short supply since Newark. Homelander stood in the intersection with the cape settling around him and said nothing for 4 seconds. He didn't need to. The presence was its own statement, the suit and the cape and the shoulders. And the fact of him filling up the visual space the way he always had. The national symbol, the absolute quantity, the thing you did not look away from. He looked north along the avenue. "I know you're here," he said. His voice carried easily. He didn't need amplification. He had never needed it. Doubt. She came from the east, which was not the direction he'd been looking, because she had not come the way he expected and had not arrived from where the signal trace had suggested. Because she had known someone would run a signal trace and had been somewhere else entirely and had moved when she chose to move. She came out of the shadow of a parking structure 2 blocks down and walked into the intersection. She did not run. She did not fly. She walked with the same measured pace that was already to anyone who had seen the Newark helicopter footage recognizable as her particular mode of arrival, unhurried, because hurry was a communication about stakes, and she had already decided what the stakes were. Homelander looked at her for a moment. "I've been waiting for this," he said. He was doing the voice, the one that was steady and flat, and suggested oceans of contained force, the one that had been making people small for a decade. "You know what I can do." She stopped 12 feet from him and said nothing. His first move was the heat vision, which was the correct tactical opening in the verse he inhabited. Focused, precise, capable of cutting through materials, rated well above standard structural tolerances. He held it for 3 full seconds, the beams crossing the 12 feet between them without wavering. The air between them distorted. Not from the heat arrived, and the heat met something, and the heat did not continue past that point in the direction intended. It sheared sideways, both beams, deflecting outward from a central axis and cutting through the glass face of the building to Homelander's right, which erupted in a curtain of shattered panes that fell for 4 stories. The beams ended. The building face was gone from the 3rd to the 7th floor. The psionic barrier that had deflected them left no visible mark on the air. Homelander processed this for approximately 1 second. Then he came in fast. He was strong. That was the truth that had to be told, because the verse he was built for made him what he was, and what he was had never been a fiction. The impact he hit with would have ended most things. He covered 12 feet in under 1/10 of a second and connected with a force that would have moved a loaded freight car. She took the impact on a psionic frame rather than her body displacing most of it outward and down into the asphalt, which cracked in a radius of 20 feet and sent pieces of street-level pavement into the air, in a pattern that the crowd on the periphery watched with the particular frozen attention of people who have not yet processed that they are near something that does not have a human scale. She moved backward 3 steps, not from the force, from the choice to absorb rather than redirect entirely. because redirecting entirely would have put several tons of transferred kinetic energy into the buildings behind her, and she had no strategic interest in demolishing the block. Homelander's fist had connected. She was still standing. He hit her again. Same result, a different flavor of the same result. The force going somewhere he hadn't aimed it, the impact producing a radius of destruction in everything except her. He grabbed for her, both hands the grip that had torn apart armored vehicles. He got his hands around her arms and pulled, and she let him pull for 2 full seconds, which he mistook for an inability to resist, which was the last mistake he made in the first phase of the engagement. She looked at him. Then she closed something, and what closed was not a hand. It was the entire field around him, tightening simultaneously in every direction that mattered, finding the joints and the tendons and the specific architecture of a body that had never been seriously taught what damage felt like, because damage had never been seriously applied to it. He had super durability. That durability had tolerances. She had not reached them yet. She was telling him very clearly what the direction of travel was. He went to his knees. The intersection had gone silent in the specific way of a large space where many people have stopped breathing at the same time. 6 camera drones from 3 different news operations were in the air. The CNN crew had a shoulder-mounted unit on the corner of 48th locked on. The woman in the coffee shop on 47th was still recording her arm braced on the window glass. A man on the 47th floor of the building, directly north, had his phone pressed to the window and was getting, without understanding it, the most widely distributed image of the following 24 hours. A straight-down angle on the intersection in which a figure in a red and blue cape was on both knees in a crater of broken asphalt, and another figure was standing in front of him with no visible effort. On their posture, no visible exertion, no indication that anything about the moment was difficult. Homelander's hands were on the ground. His head was up. His face had the expression of something happening to a person who had never before been in the situation of a face needing to make that expression. She had not struck him again. She was not standing over him with a weapon. She was simply standing with the psionic pressure applied at precisely the level that communicated the situation without misrepresenting it. You are here because I put you here, and you stay here until I decide otherwise. He tried the heat vision again. It went sideways again, cutting a horizontal line across the parked vehicles at the north end of the block, which began to burn. She raised one hand not toward him, toward the burning vehicles, and the fire went out. Not smothered, not chemically suppressed. The combustion cycle was interrupted at the source, the energy redirected elsewhere, the vehicles sitting charred but no longer producing flame. She did it without looking away from him. The man on the 47th floor was still recording. His hands were shaking. "Get up," she said. The first word she had spoken since arriving in the intersection. Low, without particular emphasis. An instruction given to something that had been assessed and categorized. Homelander's jaw moved. "You don't get up." The pressure released. He got up. He came off his knees with the specific velocity of something that was going to express its feelings about the last 3 minutes at the maximum available intensity. And he got 4 feet off the ground before she moved. The crushing grip this time was explicit, not the ambient distributed pressure of the previous exchange, but a specific targeted hold that located his center of mass and stopped him at exactly 4 feet of altitude and held him there. Not by the collar, not by a limb. By the entirety of him, addressed from every angle simultaneously, in the way that a body is inside a thing, rather than being held by it. He was suspended, 4 feet above the broken asphalt, in the middle of 48th and 6th, in front of 7 news cameras and 1,400 phones and the CNN shoulder unit, and the man on the 47th floor and the woman in the coffee shop, and the 200 people who had formed a ring at the perimeter of the intersection and had decided collectively, and against all survival instinct, not to run. Homelander's cape moved in the wind from the building that had lost its glass face. His heat vision fired twice. Both beams bent away from her and scored 2 more parallel lines of destruction across the building to his right, adding the 5th and 6th floors to the damage. She held him. He stopped firing. The silence that followed lasted 8 seconds. The man on the 47th floor counted them. He found out later, watching his own footage back, that he had been holding his breath for all 8. Homelander looked down. Not at her. He couldn't look directly at her without the heat vision reflex, which he had now learned was counterproductive. He looked at the intersection, at the crowd with their phones, at the CNN crew, at the ring of people standing at the edge of the destruction radius, watching him the way they had watched him 100 times before, except not the way they had watched him before. Because before they had been looking up, and this time they were level with him. At best, many of them, effectively looking up at a man being held in the air by something he had failed to remove. Something was changing in that crowd. He could hear it. He had super hearing. He could hear the individual heartbeats accelerating, not with the particular frequency of fear of him, the sound. He knew the sound he had measured himself by for years, but with something else, something harder to name. Something adjacent to the sound of a story being rewritten. She released him. He dropped the 4 feet and landed hard. "Don't come here again," she said without expression. This was informational. She turned and walked east on 48th. The CNN crew panned to follow her. The drones tracked. The phones tracked. The man on the 47th floor tracked. She walked 2 blocks, turned south, and was gone. Homelander stood in the intersection for 49 seconds after she left. He did not move. His cape settled. His heat vision did not fire. His fists, which had been clenched since she released him, slowly opened. The crowd did not disperse. They kept their phones up. They were looking at him now. Not after her, and the way they were looking at him was the thing he would carry for the rest of what remained of his time. At the top of this system, not fear, not awe, not the particular hunger he had cultivated in them for a decade. Something more complicated and much worse, and very close to what the human face does when it is trying to decide whether it has been deceived for a very long time. He flew, not staged, not slow and dramatic. He left the intersection at speed, which itself communicated something he had not intended to communicate, and the CNN crew caught it, and the drones caught it, and the woman in the coffee shop who had been recording for the entire duration caught it, and the man on the 47th floor, whose hands had finally stopped shaking, caught it. Butcher watched the last 40 seconds of the intersection feed on his phone in the back of the van, and did not say anything for a long time. Mother's Milk said, "There it is." "Yeah, the whole world just saw that." "Yeah." Butcher put his phone down. Outside sirens. The sound of a city trying to reorient its understanding of a fundamental assumption. He thought about 6 years of hitting Vought at the margins. Leaked files, dead informants, one step ahead, becoming one step behind the endless friction of fighting something with infinite legal and financial resources and the most powerful living weapon on Earth on its payroll. He thought about the intersection, about the 8 seconds. "She told him not to come back," Huey said. "She said this was informational." "Yeah. What does that mean?" Butcher looked at the city, at the streets that were going to be different tomorrow. Not because the buildings had changed, but because the people walking through them had seen something tonight that was going to make them look at every Vought billboard differently for the rest of their lives. "It means she wasn't trying to kill him," he said. "She was sending a message." "To who?" Butcher picked up his phone again. He looked at the still frame the man on the 47th floor's footage, already the most shared image on every platform, showing two figures in a broken intersection with a late light behind them and the crowd watching. To anyone who's still using the old map of how power works in this city, he put the phone in his pocket. Time to get in front of her. Not behind, in front. In the Vought Media Center 12 blocks north, Ashley was watching 6 screens simultaneously and doing the arithmetic on which combination of narrative responses had the least catastrophic outcome. And the answer she kept arriving at was that no such combination existed, which was a thing she had never encountered in 12 years of this work, and which made the coffee in her hand taste different from the way coffee had tasted before 7:04 p.m. On screen 3, the intersection footage ran on loop. On screen 6, the live stock ticker showed Vought International at its lowest close in 9 years. On screen 1, Homelander's public statement account had been silent for 49 minutes. She had 3 drafts open for him. She closed all 3. None of them addressed what had actually happened in that intersection, because there was no language in the PR vocabulary she had spent her career building that addressed what had actually happened in that intersection. And she had just, in the 47 minutes since the clip started running, arrived at the understanding that there wasn't going to be one. She picked up her phone. She called Edgar. He answered on the first ring, which was not how Edgar answered calls. "I know," he said. "I know what we need," he said. "I'm already on it." She almost asked what it was. She decided she didn't want to know. "The stock," she said instead. "Manageable. For now. The clip. Not manageable." A pause. The first pause she had ever heard from Edgar that was not a rhetorical device. "Ashley, what happened in that intersection is going to be in history books. Our job now is to make sure the chapter it's in doesn't end with a list of our names." He ended the call. She sat in the media center with the 6 screens running and the stock ticker dropping and the intersection on loop, and thought about that for a long time. By midnight, the intersection footage had been viewed 211 million times. Not the CNN cut, not the official Vought crisis communication. The man on the 47th floor, whose name was Daniel Cho, who was a junior associate at an architecture firm, and who had been standing at that window because he'd stayed late to finish a presentation, had posted his unedited version at 7:53 p.m., 49 seconds after Homelander left the intersection. It ran 3 minutes and 12 seconds from Homelander's landing to his departure, and it captured everything: the heat vision, shearing sideways the moment the grip took hold, the 8 seconds, and the specific quality of Homelander's exit, which the internet had already named a retreat, and which Vaught's legal team had already sent 12 cease and desist notices about to no effect whatsoever. Daniel Cho had 2 million followers by 1 a.m. He had not expected this. He had turned his phone off and gone to sleep because the alternative was worse. The comment sections were doing what comment sections did when a foundational assumption collapsed. Half of them were saying the footage was fabricated. Half were saying it proved everything they'd always suspected. A third contingent, which did not care about either of those positions, had already made 17 different memes about the 8 seconds, which were spreading faster than the original. Ashley read the comment sections. She did it because she couldn't stop, and because somewhere in the discipline of counting the damage there was the feeling of still having something to count. At 2 a.m., she closed her laptop and sat in her office and thought for the first time in 12 years about whether she should call her mother. She did not call her mother. She opened her laptop again. The Vought board reconvened at 6 a.m. Edgar ran it again. He had no slides. "The situation has evolved," he said, which was the kind of sentence that communicated nothing, while technically saying something, and which nobody in the room called him on, because everyone in the room was using similar sentences in their own heads to avoid engaging with the full shape of what had happened. The head of security said the black site rollout was 91% complete. 3 remaining facilities were still in transition. 2 had experienced what he called secondary interference events overnight, which meant Kerrigan had found 2 of the rerouted sites using the personnel database she had taken from Site 11. And those sites had been processed in the same systematic way as the others. And the documentation from them was now wherever she was keeping the documentation from all the others. The head of legal said their government relations team had received 9 separate inquiries from congressional staffers in the past 14 hours, none of them in the category of concern they wanted. The head of PR, not Ashley. Ashley was too junior for board calls, which had never stopped being absurd given what she actually did said. Homelander's public statement from the previous evening had been viewed in the context of the Cho footage and had generated a specific category of response that he described as counterproductive, meaning someone asked. Meaning the statement says he's in control of the situation, the PR head said, and the footage of him leaving an intersection under circumstances that do not support that characterization has been intercut with the statement by approximately 47,000 individual users across 6 platforms in the last 8 hours. A pause. Pull the statement, Edgar said. We already tried. The intercut versions are... Pull our version, Edgar said. The original. We stop amplifying our own narrative against the footage. That's essentially an admission. It's damage limitation, Edgar said. We are past the point of winning the narrative. We are at the point of choosing which version of losing is least catastrophic. He looked at the table. I need 2 things from this room. First, what assets do we have that have not yet been committed? Second, what government relationships can we activate that don't require a public paper trail? The room considered this. The asking of those 2 questions in that order meant something that everyone present understood and that no one said out loud. At 7 a.m., in a building that did not appear in any Vought documentation, a woman named Victoria Newman received a phone call from a number she kept saved in her contacts under the name of a dental office that she had not patronized in 4 years. She was already awake. She had been awake since the Cho footage posted, which had happened 12 hours before the call. And she had spent those 12 hours doing 2 things simultaneously. Watching the public response with the clinical attention of someone taking inventory of a geopolitical shift, and receiving a series of increasingly unsubtle communications from 3 different power structures, suggesting that her unique capabilities might be of use in the current situation. She had not responded to any of those communications because responding required committing, and committing required knowing which way the wind was going to be blowing in 72 hours, which she did not yet know. The call from the dental office number changed the calculation. The board wants a resolution, said the voice on the other end. She recognized it. Clean, no attribution chain. They're prepared to offer the full package. The full package was a phrase with a specific meaning between them that had taken 3 years of careful cultivation to arrive at. I need terms, she said. Complete immunity for the exposure documents, federal clearance for the biosite records, and the Senate committee slot when the seat opens in March. She looked at her window. Outside, the city was starting up with the sounds it made at 7 a.m. Traffic trash collection, the ordinary percussive evidence of a place that was still despite everything operating on its usual schedule. I need to assess the target first, she said. We've been gathering that information since Facility 9. Send it to the secure address. She paused. And tell them I need to see a body before I talk about the Senate. She ended the call. She sat with the terms for a few minutes. 3 years of working toward the committee seat, the immunity, the file clearance. All of it now apparently available in one transaction, because Vought was frightened enough to offer the full package. That was the part she kept returning to. How frightened they had to be to offer all of it at once. Homelander had spent the night in the residential level of Vought Tower, which was not usual. He usually went to the penthouse. The penthouse had a view of the city, and the city currently had a specific quality of looking back at him that he was finding difficult to manage. He had the feeds running. All of them news, social, the internal Vought communications channels he was supposed to access only through the approved dashboard. He had bypassed the approved dashboard months ago. He had been watching the company's internal communications directly for weeks, which was the kind of thing that would have caused a governance crisis in a functional organization, and had simply been added to the list of things about Homelander that Vought handled by pretending were not happening. The feeds were bad. The 200 million view number he had refreshed 11 times since midnight. The memes he had watched for 40 minutes before he acknowledged what he was doing and closed the app, then reopened it 6 minutes later. The analytical coverage, not the simple "was this real" debates, but the careful institutional assessments from former military advisors and security experts who were now talking on television about whether any of the physical infrastructure of the United States government was adequate to address a threat with that capability profile, and who were uniformly concluding that the answer was unclear, and probably no. He had not been in those conversations. Nobody had asked Homelander. He had also been watching the internal security feeds. The overnight reports from 2 more rollout sites coming back with the same terminology: complete loss, entity departure confirmed, documentation status unknown. He had watched Brannigan deliver those reports to Edgar via secure channel at 4 a.m. He had watched Edgar's response, which was 2 sentences, and one of those sentences had contained the phrase, "Activate the secondary option." He did not know what the secondary option was. He found that specifically intolerable. He called Edgar at 8 a.m. Edgar answered on the second ring. I expected this call earlier. What's the secondary option? A pause that was not a rhetorical device. It was the pause of a man deciding how much of the truth to offer. We're exploring solutions that don't require public engagement, Edgar said. Meaning you're going around me again. Meaning we're using every available resource.
Wayne.
I want to know what that means. Homelander. Edgar's voice was the same as it always was. Flat cool, carrying the faint suggestion that emotions were a resource he had stopped allocating. What happened in that intersection is not recoverable by the same methods that built what preceded it. I am using methods appropriate to the current situation. You will be briefed when there is something actionable for you. Actionable for me? Homelander laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. You're going to use one of your political instruments. Something knife-like. Something you kept in a drawer for exactly the situation that you never told me about. Silence. Tell me I'm wrong, Homelander said. Edgar did not tell him he was wrong. Homelander ended the call. He stood at the window of the residential level, looking at a city that he knew with a certainty that was worse than being unsure was not going to look at him, the same way it had yesterday, and thought about the 8 seconds, about the 49 seconds after she left, about the man on the 47th floor whose footage had stripped something out of the world that could not be replaced. He thought about how to put it back. He arrived at conclusions that were not good. Butcher had been awake since the footage posted. He had watched the Cho video 19 times. Not to enjoy it, though. There was something in him that answered to it in a way he was not going to examine too closely, but to study it. The body language, the timing, The specific choices she had made about what to destroy and what to leave intact and when to stop and what to say. This was informational. 3 words. He had been running them through his head since 7:53 p.m. the night before. Not this is a warning that would have been about her. Not you are defeated that would have been about Homelander. This was informational, past tense, as in the purpose of this engagement was to communicate data. You have now received it. He was sitting in the van with Mother's Milk, who had also been awake since the footage posted, and who had said very little, which was how Mother's Milk processed things that were too large for his usual framework. She's not going after him, Butcher said. Mother's Milk looked at him. She went there to make a point not to finish him. If she wanted him dead, he'd be dead. She's got the files. She knows where he is. She knows what Edgar's doing. She went there to demonstrate something, for the record. Butcher looked at the phone in his hand. At the Cho footage paused on the 8 seconds. She's not in the business of personal revenge. She's in the business of making the thing that produces the homelands of the world impossible to keep running. That's a very large objective. Yeah. We can't help with that. No. Butcher put the phone down. But we can make sure that when the part that requires a specific person in a specific place happens, that person is somewhere useful. He looked at the ceiling of the van. She's going to go after the structure. The deep structure, whoever Edgar's been calling on. The second phone, whatever the fallback layer looks like. The thing under the thing, under the thing. She's going to go after it because it's the only part of this that she hasn't taken yet. How do we get in front of that? Butcher was quiet for a moment. We don't, he said. We get to her first. Before she gets to the layer we don't know about. Before whatever Edgar just activated in that 4 a.m. call becomes something we're picking up pieces of. He sat up. Because I'll tell you what I know about Vought when it's scared. It doesn't get smarter. It gets dirtier. And dirty I can navigate. But dirty, plus whatever is coming for her aimed in the same direction in a city full of civilians who already watched the intersection. He stopped. Mother's Milk looked at him steadily. Say it! Butcher looked at his hands, at the phone, at the Cho footage. I think we got exactly what I wanted, he said. And I think if we don't get ahead of it right now, what comes next is going to be a lot harder to live in than what came before. It was the closest thing to fear that Mother's Milk had heard from Butcher in 6 years. He stored that information and said nothing. The third overnight rollout site came back at 10 a.m. with the same assessment as the others. Edgar read the report. He filed it under the category that he was with increasing frequency no longer able to name with his usual administrative precision. He opened his laptop. He looked at the map of active Vought infrastructure, the visible parts, the semi-visible parts, and the layer beneath that, which had not yet been touched, which he had always believed was untouchable, because it existed nowhere that could be read from the outside. He was no longer confident of that assessment. He called the secure line one more time and gave a single instruction that activated a process he had been keeping in reserve for 4 years. The release of an asset that the board had argued about that 2 prior administrations had decided was too unstable for deployment, and that Edgar had maintained in readiness anyway, because he understood in the part of himself where professional caution gave way to something more honest, that there were problems that required more damage than solutions. The asset's name was Benjamin. The people who had encountered him in operational settings called him something else. The paperwork took 11 minutes. Edgar closed the folder. He sat in his office with the city outside his window and the infrastructure map on his screen, and the knowledge that the thing he had just authorized was the last move available to him. That was not a completed mission of defeat. He was not certain it was not a completed mission of defeat. He sat with that for a moment, and then he opened a new document and began preparing the briefing that would tell Homelander, in the most manageable terms possible, that the secondary option had been activated, and that his role in the coming engagement was to be visible, public, and pointedly not in the way. The briefing room Newman used for meetings of this category seated 4 people and had no windows, no recording devices, which she verified personally before every such meeting using a scanner that did not appear in her expense reports. The room was in a building that belonged to a civic advocacy group she had founded in 2019, which was real and did real work, and was also the most efficiently constructed blind she had built in 15 years of building blinds. The Vought liaison sat across from her. His name was Strickland. He was the kind of man produced by organizations that required its messengers to look like nothing important was being communicated, mid-50s, unremarkable in every register, the physical presence of a certified letter. He laid a single folder on the table. He did not open it. "The board appreciates your willingness to consider this," he said. "I haven't agreed to anything," Newman said. "I'm considering the brief." "Of course." She opened the folder herself. The brief was 8 pages. The operational parameters were on page 3, the target profile on page 4, the supporting intelligence on 5 and 6, and the terms on 7. She read all of it. She read page 4 twice. "This is current?" she asked. "As of 72 hours ago. The mobility profile here." She tapped page 4. "This suggests the target moves through psionic displacement, not standard locomotion. Our people haven't confirmed a fixed pattern." "Correct. The operating assumption is that she positions herself based on where she anticipates response infrastructure will be activated, not based on geographic convenience. So she reads ahead of the target, not toward it. That's the working model." Newman closed the folder. She looked at Strickland with the expression she had refined over a decade and a half of political work. The expression that communicated careful consideration while revealing no calculation whatsoever. "If I engage," she said, "and fail to resolve, what's the contingency?" Strickland was quiet for a moment, in the way of a man who had been told what to say about every question except this one. "The board has a parallel asset being deployed independently. Soldier Boy." He did not confirm this. He did not deny it. "If both assets are in motion simultaneously," Newman said, "there's a collateral geometry problem. The board has assessed that risk." "The board has assessed it," she repeated, "and decided that 2 independent lethal assets operating toward the same high-mobility target in a populated area is acceptable. They've decided it's necessary." Newman looked at the folder. At page 4, at the mobility profile of a thing that moved the way weather moved and read the response architecture, the way she read a legislative chamber in advance through relationships, through the shape of what other people were going to do before they did it. She picked up the folder. She put it in her bag. "I'll need 48 hours of position tracking before I commit to an engagement window," she said. "And I want the Senate confirmation in writing before I move." "The board's position is that confirmation is contingent on—" "I know what their position is," Newman said. "I'm telling you mine." She stood. 48 hours, in writing. Then we talk about windows. Strickland nodded and gathered nothing from the table because there was nothing left to gather. He left. Newman stayed in the room for a few minutes thinking about the mobility profile, about the way the brief's language kept circling around the same absence. They could not predict where the target would be. Only where she had been and what she had chosen to take from each location. She thought about the intersection footage. She thought about 8 seconds. Soldier Boy arrived at the staging area outside Baltimore at 11 p.m. in the back of a vehicle that had been purpose-built for this transfer, driven by 2 men who had not been told his name. and who would not be told. He had been in cryo storage for 42 days, a routine maintenance cycle, as Vaught's containment team described it, and the 42 days had done nothing to improve his disposition. He stood in the staging bay and looked at the equipment laid out for him and said, "This is everything." The containment coordinator, a woman named Walsh, who had managed the previous 3 deployments, said, "Per the protocol." The protocol. He picked up the chest piece of his gear and checked the fit with the specific attention of someone who trusted his own assessment of equipment over any documentation. The protocol was written by people who've never been in the field. The protocol was approved by... I don't care who approved it. He buckled the chest piece. Where's the target? We don't have a fixed... Where was the target last confirmed? Walsh checked her device. The Baltimore Logistics Corridor. 12 hours ago. She hit a secondary storage node documentation breach, same operational signature as the previous. Where's the corridor? She gave him the grid reference. He studied it for exactly the time it took to decide he had enough. He picked up the rest of his gear. What are the civilian density parameters? Walsh asked. It was a required field in the protocol checklist. He looked at her. I'll take that as non-binding, she said, and made a note that she had asked. Butcher had been tracking the Baltimore corridor since the previous afternoon, not because he had predicted the next incursion point he had, but predicting it wasn't the hard part. The hard part was that he had predicted it and had driven down the night before and had found a position with a sightline to the access road and had waited, and she had not come in through the access road. She had come in through the building 3 blocks north, moved through the connecting infrastructure at sub-ground level, and been gone before the Vought response team was even dispatched. He had been watching the wrong point of the compass for 40 minutes while she processed the node and left. That was the part that was getting to him. Not that she was faster, that she was always somewhere else, that the logic of her movement was legible. He could read the destination, but the approach was always orthogonal to whatever he'd anticipated. She was not evading him. She simply wasn't accounting for him, which was worse because evasion implied awareness, and this was something more complete. He was sitting in the van with Mother's Milk in the industrial stretch south of Baltimore when the Soldier Boy signal hit their scanner. Not a direct signal. A secondary echo off a Vought tactical frequency they'd had a tap on for 3 months encrypted, but not encrypted for them. Frenchie read the frequency pattern and said, "That's a deployment signature." "For what?" Huey said. "Something very large." Frenchie pulled the pattern apart on his screen. Something with a very large power signature. Something that was in cryo 42 days ago, according to the containment log we pulled from Soldier Boy, Butcher said. The van was quiet. "They thawed him," Mother's Milk said. "They thawed him, and they're putting him in the corridor," Butcher said. He looked at the scanner, at the power signature, at the grid reference attached to the deployment. Same zone, same 12-hour lag from her last confirmed position. He leaned back. "They think she's coming back." "Is she?" Butcher thought about it. About the mobility profile, about the way she read response infrastructure before she moved. "She already knows he's there," he said. "She read the deployment the moment they activated him. She knows where he is, she knows what he is, and she's going to decide whether the secondary storage node is worth the engagement." He looked at the grid reference. "If she decides it's worth it. Then we have Kerrigan and Soldier Boy in the same grid," Huey said. "In a populated industrial zone. With whatever Vought secondary assets they stage around him," Mother's Milk added, and a response team standing by to manage the aftermath. "And," Frenchie said very quietly, "the civilian workers who are on night shift in that zone right now who have no idea any of this is happening." Butcher looked at the grid reference for a long moment. "Move the van," he said. "We're going to the zone." She came in from the south at 1:17 a.m. Not the access road, not the subground infrastructure. She came across open ground from the waterfront, walking in from the harbor's edge in the dark. And the only reason the Vought perimeter sensors picked her up at all was that she chose to let them, which the sensor team would understand 3 minutes later when the reasoning became obvious. Soldier Boy was positioned in the central bay of the node facility. Walsh had tried to brief him on response protocols. He had listened to the first 40 seconds and then walked to the central bay and stood there because the central bay gave him the most room and the most structure to direct the blast. If it came to that, and that was the extent of his tactical methodology. He heard her before he saw her. Not footsteps. A pressure change. A shift in the air quality of the bay that he had last felt in a jungle in 1972 and recognized with the specific body memory of someone who has survived one thing by processing the physics of it quickly enough to still be there afterward. She came through the north wall of the bay, not through a door. Through the wall itself, the corrugated panels separating from their mounts and folding back like paper, folded back the whole section of wall opening in a controlled and deliberate manner that was the exact opposite of explosive entry and was more disturbing for it. He charged. He did not use tactics. Soldier Boy in full engagement was a freight train that had decided it had opinions, and he closed 40 feet of bay floor in under 2 seconds with everything committed, which was the correct choice against almost anything in his operational history and which produced a result he had not experienced since the 1980s. The thing he was charging did not move. She stopped him the same way a wall stops a charge, except the wall was not a surface, but a field, and the field distributed his momentum outward and downward into the concrete floor, which cracked in a star pattern with him at the center. And he went to one knee, and his tactical assessment in that moment was accurate. This was different. He triggered the chest blast. The detonation radius in the bay was 90 feet. Every unsecured object in that radius moved violently. The corrugated walls that had already been opened distorted further. The lighting infrastructure came down. 2 Vought tactical units that had been staged outside the north perimeter were knocked off their feet by the shockwave traveling through the structure. She took the full detonation at a range of 12 feet. She did not move backward. The air around her had compressed in the instant before the blast, in a way that was visible for exactly that instant. A sphere of different density atmosphere, held by something that was not the atmosphere. The blast energy hit the sphere's edge, and the sphere converted most of it, and what was left came through as heat and light and residual force in amounts that were significant but not decisive. And when the light cleared, she was standing in the same position. Her upper back extension spread wide now, fully deployed, and her expression was the expression of something that had been informed and was now responding. She raised her right hand. The focused burst hit him from a range of 8 feet and traveled in a line from her palm to his sternum and through it and out his back and into the wall behind him. Not a killing blow. The geometry was too precise for accident. It was sized to end his capacity for the chest blast. Specifically, the targeting found the mechanism and disrupted it without structural catastrophe, the way a surgeon removes a component rather than the body that contains it. He went down. He was still alive. He was damaged in ways that would require significant time and resources to address. And the chest blast was no longer available to him, and he was down, and she was standing. Starlight reached the zone perimeter at 1:22 a.m. She had followed the Vought scanner traffic on a tap of her own different source than Butcher's same general intelligence picture and had gotten there in time to see the shock wave from the detonation roll out of the North Bay and across the service road, where 3 civilian maintenance workers had been eating in a vehicle parked at the service entrance. The vehicle had been moved 40 feet by the wave. She got to it first. All 3 workers were alive. 2 had injuries that were going to require more than a field response. She got them out of the vehicle and away from the service road and called for emergency services from her personal phone, not from any Vought channel. While she was doing this, the Vought tactical response team arrived at the bay. She could hear them. She could hear the radio transmissions that made absolutely clear they were there to clean the scene, not to assist the workers. She looked at the 3 people she had just pulled from a vehicle that had been thrown 40 feet by a detonation that had been authorized by a company that described those same 3 people as acceptable collateral geometry. She took more photos. Sir, Newman reached the approach corridor at 1:31 a.m. She had spent the 2 hours since the briefing room reading position data, and the position data had told her something the brief had. Now, the target did not return to completed locations. Ever. The Baltimore node was done. She was not coming back. The Soldier Boy deployment had been staged at a completed location. She stood in the approach corridor and looked at the grid reference on her device and understood that the deployment had been staged where the board expected the target to return because the board was still reading her, the way you read a person in terms of goals, objectives, return visits, interest in specific things. They were not reading her the way you read weather. She had come to complete a different node, the one Newman was standing near. The pressure change started before she turned around. It came from behind her, from the direction she had been walking away from a space she had cleared and assessed and decided was empty. And it was the kind of pressure change that her body recognized as wrong. Before her mind finished the sentence, she was supposed to be at the... She turned. She threw the targeted rupture immediately. No warning, no conversation, straight to the mechanism. She had used 100 times the focused biokinetic force aimed at the cranial vasculature of the thing in front of her, that she had been told could be killed like anything else if she could get inside the biology. The force hit. It stopped at approximately the surface, not deflected outward, not absorbed and dissipated. It stopped converted and returned inward along its own trajectory in a modification so specific that it could only have been performed by something that understood the mechanism well enough to use it as a return address. Newman's nose bled first. Then she went to her knees. She had never been on her knees in a professional engagement. In 14 years, she had the sudden comprehensive understanding of everyone she had ever put on their knees, and it was not comparable to watching it happen from the other side. And it lasted approximately 3 seconds before the pressure from outside reached her vasculature and made the next several seconds a matter of surviving rather than assessing. Kerrigan held the returned force at exactly the edge of threshold. Not enough to complete the rupture, enough to communicate that the threshold existed and she was standing at it. She looked at Newman on the ground. "Tell them," she said, "that I know about the secondary option." She paused. "Tell them I've known since the briefing room." She released. Newman stayed on the ground for a moment, not because she was unable to move, but because she was taking stock of what had just happened to her, understanding of what was possible. Then she got up because getting up was the only move that preserved anything. Kerrigan was already gone. Butcher arrived at the service road outside the North Bay at 1:34 a.m. He walked through the scene, the cracked concrete, the distorted walls, Soldier Boy on the floor of the central bay. With 4 Vought medical personnel working on him, the worker's starlight had pulled from the vehicle, the tactical clean team already running their protocols. He stood in the doorway of the North Bay and looked at Soldier Boy. He had seen a lot of things in this work that were designed to end something definitively. This was Vought's last physical asset. Its last, more damage than solution option, deployed because everything else had run out. And it was on the floor of a warehouse in Baltimore, with a hole through its chest mechanism alive, because she had chosen not to kill it, which was not the same as her being unable to kill it. Mother's milk came up beside him. There it is. Yeah. That was everything they had. Yeah. Butcher looked at the tactical clean team, at the workers on the roadside, at the scope of what Vought had been willing to authorize tonight. 2 simultaneous lethal assets, both deployed into a populated zone, both of which had produced collateral, and neither of which had produced a resolution. They opened every drawer, he said. Soldier Boy, Newman. 2 different vectors, same night, same target area. He was quiet for a moment. And she knew. She knew about both before she came in. How? Because she reads the response before it's activated. She's been doing it since Facility 9. He turned away from the bay. She went for the node they weren't covering. She let Soldier Boy detonate in an empty engagement because it cost her nothing. She showed Newman what happens when you try to use her own weapon type against a thing that understands the weapon better than she does. He walked back toward the van. Around him, the industrial zone was doing what industrial zones did when something catastrophic had happened and the cleanup operation had arrived before the press, going very quiet and very efficient in a way that was designed to look like nothing. We have to get to Vought Tower, he said. Mother's milk said, why? Because that's where she's going. Butcher opened the van door. Not because we told her, not because we sent her, because that's the only piece she hasn't taken yet. The head of the organization, the architecture that runs the whole thing. He got in. And because if she gets there before we do, and Edgar does whatever Edgar is planning as the actual final move, the number of people who don't survive the next 24 hours is going to be a lot higher than it needs to be, Frenchie said from the back. And if she's already there when we arrive. Butcher looked at the dark outside the van window, at the Baltimore service road, at the Vought clean team working under the facility lights with the specific professionalism of people paid to make large problems invisible. Then we get there anyway, he said, and we make sure whatever happens gets seen. She arrived at Vought Tower at 3:14 a.m. Not through the lobby, not through the loading bay or the service entrance, or any of the 17 access points that the security team had sealed and reinforced in the 48 hours since Baltimore. She came through the northeast face of the building at the 42nd floor, because the 42nd floor contained the primary data hub for Vaught's Black Infrastructure Coordination Layer, the last archive that connected the visible company to everything it had spent 30 years building underneath itself. And because the 42nd floor was where that connection was held, and because she had known this since she accessed the sub-level 3 terminal at Facility 9 and had been waiting for the appropriate time to address it. The appropriate time was now. The glass of the 42nd floor northeast face held for approximately 1 second under the psionic field she applied to it. Then it did not hold. It separated into pieces that fell outward 42 stories above street level in a curtain of fractured surface that caught the city lights on the way down and scattered them in every direction before hitting the plaza below, which was empty of civilians because the NYPD had established a 2-block perimeter at 11 p.m., following an anonymous tip that the building was a potential engagement site. The tip had come from Starlight's phone, using a number that did not connect to her. Thus humming. Inside the 42nd floor, 4 Vought security contractors had been stationed at the data hub access point since midnight. They were the best available after the Baltimore drawdown, which meant they were very good and had no meaningful context for what was coming through the window. She moved through the floor in 4 minutes and 20 seconds. The first security post went down when she pulled the door housing away from the frame and walked through the resulting opening without slowing. The contractors who opened fire discovered that their rounds were being collected between them and her, and held in suspension, which they had heard about from the Facility 9 briefing, but which read very differently in person. 2 of them stopped firing. The other two she redirected toward the far wall, not gently, and left them there. The data hub was on the far end of the floor. The primary archive, drive the one that has held the connecting tissue between Vought's public-facing operations and everything underneath. She accessed directly, extracting the core assembly with the same methodical precision she had used at every prior location, working through the architecture level by level, taking what was relevant and burning what wasn't from the interior of its own housing. She left the connection logs intact. She left the evidence of what had been stored there. She left the audit trail. She wanted the audit trail. Butcher's team was already in the building. He had used the same 48 hours that Vought spent sealing entry points to identify the one they couldn't seal, a maintenance shaft on the south side that connected to an infrastructure corridor Vought didn't own, which ran under the building and surfaced in the parking structure. Frenchie had mapped it from city engineering documents. They had come in at 2:45 a.m. and reached the server core on the 38th floor at 3:11. The server core was not the primary archive, but it was the secondary distribution node, the layer that broadcast Vaught's internal communications to its external network of shell companies, political liaisons, and regulatory capture operations. Butcher had a drive the size of a deck of cards that Frenchie had built over 3 months for exactly this access point. He plugged it in at 3:13. It began pulling everything on the secondary distribution layer and pushing it encrypted to 17 different servers in 9 different countries, each of them operated by people who had been waiting for this payload for varying periods of time, ranging from 8 months to 3 years. Butcher stood in the server room and watched the transfer bar while the building above him began to come apart. Homelander came in through the roof at 3:19. Not because anyone had told him to. Not because he had a plan. Because he had been watching the building's internal security feeds from the penthouse of a hotel 3 blocks away. He had not been inside Vought Tower since the day after the intersection, because the building had started looking at him differently after the intersection, which was a sensation he could not explain in useful terms, but which was accurate. And when the northeast face of 42 went out, he had made a decision that was not a decision so much as a reflex, older than the version of himself that was capable of strategy. He landed on the roof and burned through the access hatch and came down the stairwell fast. She was on 43 when he arrived. She had gone up a floor after the archive. He hit the stairwell door at the landing hard enough to take it off the frame, and the hallway beyond was dark because the power for floors 40 through 45 had been redistributed into the psionic fieldwork happening on the outer walls of the building, which was something the building management systems had not been designed to process and were responding to by shutting down non-essential functions. And the hallway was dark except for the city light coming through the windows on the east side. She was standing in the hallway. She had not been startled. She had not reoriented. She was standing in the hallway facing the stairwell door he had just come through, which meant she had known the trajectory of his approach before he arrived at the roof. He looked at her in the dark hallway with the city behind her and said, "You're going to fight me here, on my terms, in my building." "Aman," she said nothing. He came in at full speed. "Ashur Hadrik." The hallway ran the length of the floor's northern face, 200 feet of office corridor glass partition walls, a central support column every 40 feet. He hit the first column before he hit her, because she was not where she had been when he began the approach, and she was not where she had been, because she had moved with the kind of economy that did not waste itself on drama. He pivoted. His heat vision took the partition walls apart from left to right, a horizontal sweep at chest height, and it would have ended most engagements in his operational experience. But the sweep found a surface before it found her. The same surface it had found in the intersection, a compression of something that turned directed energy into a problem for the structure rather than the target, and 3 partitions became slag, and the 2 beyond them had a new horizontal feature at chest height. and she was behind the fourth column. He flew. 40 feet of hallway in a fraction of a second, the force of his impact on the fourth column carrying through it and into the floor and the ceiling. Simultaneously, the column cracking from base to header plaster and structural aggregate coming down in a section 15 feet across. She was not behind the fourth column. She was above it. She had gone up when he went forward, because forward was the axis he had committed to, and the ceiling of an office building was not for her a ceiling. She came down onto his back from above, and the grip she applied was the most explicit version of it she had used in the entire engagement. Not ambient, not distributed, but targeted with the full specificity of something that knew exactly what it was holding and had decided exactly what to do with it. His arms locked. The heat vision fired twice. Both beams went into the floor, cutting parallel trenches through the carpet and the subfloor and into the ceiling of 42, which added structural concerns to the floor below. She pulled him upward through the ceiling, not by levitation, by moving through it, while maintaining the grip, taking him through the floor of 44 in a column of fractured concrete and rebar that left a hole in the building structure 40 feet in diameter, ascending through 44 and into 45, where the exterior wall of the north face waited. She pressed him against it. Not into it, against it. The glass was intact. Beyond it, the city. Every news helicopter that had been circling since the northeast face of 42 went out. Every phone camera on the 2 blocks that the NYPD cordon had not successfully evacuated because New York City at 3 a.m. was not a place where 2-block cordons successfully evacuated people who had decided to watch. He was against the glass, and she was holding him there, and the city was watching. "You're afraid," he said. His voice was still doing the things it did even now. The control, the flatness, the suggestion of force beneath everything. "You know I'm stronger than—" "No," she said. One word, not contemptuous, not triumphant, purely corrective. She pressed him harder into the glass. It cracked from his shoulders outward in a star pattern, holding, not shattering, not yet. And his face was against it, and the city was looking at his face against the glass, and he could see the phone screens below him. Tiny rectangles of light all pointed up. He could hear the sound from street level. It was not the sound of people who were afraid of him. It was the sound of people watching something that was changing the architecture of something they had believed their entire lives, and the architecture was being changed in real time. And the sound it made as it changed was not the sound of fear. It was the sound of understanding arriving. He fired the heat vision into the glass. The glass shattered outward. He drove forward out of it with everything he had. She caught him in the open air 45 stories above 51st Street with both hands. Not literally. There were no hands. There was the full application of what she was, the totality of the pressure she had been applying in measured doses throughout everything that had come before, finally opened to its actual scale. And the actual scale was not a grip or a field or a zone. It was the absence of any alternative. He was in the open air, and there was no direction he could move that was not already addressed. He struggled for 11 seconds. Then, she brought him back to the edge of the floor. She held him at the shattered wall of 45, suspended against the open face of the building, with the city spread behind him, and she looked at him for a long moment in the way she looked at things she was finishing. His heat vision tried once more. A reflex by then, not a choice. She closed her right hand. The sound of it was specific and dreadful and not long. The city below heard it. The helicopters caught it. 45 floors of glass and steel framed a man who had been described as a god for a decade, and the man fell, and the glass and steel remained indifferent, as structures tend to be when the symbols attached to them are removed. Edgar was on the 63rd floor in his office when the building started coming apart structurally below him. He had watched the 42nd floor breach on his internal monitors. He had watched the 38th floor server room go offline, which meant the secondary distribution layer was being pulled, which meant in approximately 4 hours, every shell company, political liaison, regulatory operation, and financial instrument attached to Vought's invisible infrastructure would become visible to 17 different legal and journalistic entities simultaneously, because that was what Butcher's drive was designed to do. And Butcher had been planning this access for 3 months, and Edgar had not known. He had not known. In 30 years of running operations of this complexity, he had not been in a position where his information advantage was 0. He sat with that for a moment. Not with the panic of someone whose tools had been taken, with the stillness of someone who recognized the shape of a position clearly and was determining whether any move remained. He was still making that determination when she came through the door. Not the door, the wall beside it. The door itself was intact. She had chosen the wall because it was less structural than the door frame and the collapsed geometry was cleaner. She stood in his office and looked at him with the same quality of attention she gave to everything assessing, categorizing, deciding. He did not stand. He had been asked once by a senator why he never stood when people entered his office, and he had said that standing communicated something he was not always prepared to commit to. He did not stand now. "You understand what I have," she said. "Yes. You understand what's already been distributed." "I understand what will be distributed in approximately 4 hours," he said. "Yes." She looked at him, at the desk, at the window, at the city behind the window, which was lit up in the specific way of a city that had been watching something for 3 hours and had not yet stopped. "You built something very large," she said. "I did. It was very effective for a long time." He looked at her. The thing about Edgar was that even now, at the end of the only conversation that was going to be both literal and final, he was doing the thing he always did, looking at a situation and determining whether there was a position that preserved something. "Is there something you want?" he said. "Or is this already decided?" "It was decided at Facility 9, she said. "I'm here because this was the last room." He looked at his desk. At the folder on it, the briefing he had prepared for Homelander about the secondary asset which he had not delivered because Homelander had gone to the building before the briefing was sent, which had made the briefing irrelevant. Small ironies in a large collapse. "Then I suppose," he said, "that's the assessment." She did not do it dramatically. She did not make a speech. She reached across whatever distance existed between her and the capacity of his body to continue functioning, and she applied what was required, and it was quick. And the city outside the window went on doing what it did, indifferent to the disappearance of one more man who had believed very fully in his own structural importance. Butcher finished the transfer at 3:51 a.m. He watched the progress bar complete and then pulled the drive and put it in his jacket pocket with the specific care of someone handling a thing that has just changed the shape of the next several years. The building was still standing. Parts of it were not standing in the way. Buildings preferred to stand 42 had structural issues. Now 45 had a large open section in its north face. The stairwells above the 40th floor were compromised by the vertical path through 44. But the building was not collapsing, because she had not been interested in collapsing it. She had been interested in what was inside it. He came up through the parking structure with Mother's Milk at 4:02. The plaza was not quiet, but a different kind of noise than combat. The sound of 200 people who had been there since the cordon went up, and who were now looking at the 45th floor, where the open section faced the street and trying to process what they had seen fall. Butcher looked up at the 45th floor. He thought about a pub in London, about a name on a warrant, about 6 years of building toward a moment that had just happened inside a 63-story tower He had not been inside for, and had not needed to be inside for, because the thing that had made it happen was not his, and had never been his, and he was going to have to make his peace with that. He thought about Homelander. He had wanted it to feel like he'd won something, the way revenge was supposed to feel, the way he had always assumed it would feel when the day finally came. Something resolving, something releasing. It felt like standing next to a tide that had gone out and left the sea floor exposed, and the sea floor was not the clean sand bottom of anything salvageable. And the tide was gone now, and whatever came next was going to have to deal with what the water had been covering. Mother's Milk stood beside him and said nothing, which was the correct thing to do. Starlight had been on the street since 2:30 a.m. She had seen the 42nd floor go. She had seen the building security teams and the NYPD negotiating perimeter questions that the building rendered irrelevant by the time they were resolved. She had seen the north face of 45 come apart. And she had been the person nearest to the falling glass on 51st, who had covered the 3 civilians who had not cleared the cordon in time, using her body and the light emission as a shield, taking the glass and the wind and the structural fragments and distributing them with her own power in directions that did not include the 3 people behind her. 2 of them had injuries. Nobody had died. She looked at the 45th floor after it went quiet, at the open section, at the city lights catching the broken glass on the plaza, at the news helicopters that were still up, that would be up all night, that would be up for days, because the footage was never going to stop and the questions were never going to stop, and the world was not going to simply absorb what it had seen in this building over the past 4 hours and continue as before. She had known in the abstract that the system was this bad. She had been building files, gathering evidence, making the cautious, incremental moves of someone who understood what she was inside and was trying to change it without being destroyed by it. What she had not fully understood, in some protected corner of herself, that had still believed in the possibility of institutional reform, was the sheer scale of the lie. Not the wrongdoing she had known about the wrongdoing. The lie. The gap between the surface and what Butcher's Drive was going to expose in 4 hours. The distance between the Vought that had sponsored her first press appearance and the Vought that had built Site 11. She had photos of Site 11 on her phone. She had sent them to a reporter 8 days ago. She checked now whether the reporter had responded. The reporter had sent 5 messages in the last 2 hours, the most recent of which read everything we talked about. I need you on record. She looked at the building, at the open face, at the city. She typed back, give me until morning. She walked east on 51st and did not look back. The building was behind her. The helicopters were behind her. The news cycle that was going to consume the next several years of every institution that had touched Vought in any capacity was behind her. She had what she had come for. The last archive. The connecting layer. The documentation that completed the picture she had been building since Facility 9. The full map of how the system had sustained itself, who had held what piece of it, and what had been done in its name to what categories of people. It was not revenge. She did not have a word for it in the language of this world, which was a small world, a world that had confused the presence of people with extraordinary physical capability for the presence of people with extraordinary moral authority, and had built its entire political and cultural architecture on that confusion for 30 years, and was now going to have to find something else to build on. She did not know what that would be. She had not come here to decide it. She had come to remove a specific thing, and the thing was removed. She walked east until the building was out of sight. Then she stopped and looked at the sky above the city, the particular quality of sky that Manhattan had at 4 a.m., orange-gray, from the lights below, no stars visible. The helicopter lights moving in holding patterns that were going to continue indefinitely. She did not need this world, not. She did not need its gratitude or its fear, or the particular kind of attention it had been paying her since she woke up in a facility in Virginia and understood what kind of system she had woken up inside. She had done what she had come to do. She walked until she was gone. The files began distributing at 7:41 a.m. By noon, 3 congressional committees had announced investigations. 2 major Vought institutional partners had issued statements of distance. The stock had been halted. By evening, the hashtag that carried the contents of the Black Infrastructure Archive, the trial records, the shell structures, the personnel assignments, the 40-page NDAs, and the condition grade charts and the names was the most searched term in 17 countries. Butcher watched some of it from a bar in Queens. He had a drink. He had a second drink. He turned the television off and looked at the wall. Huey said after a while, "We did it." Butcher looked at his glass. "We didn't do anything," he said. "We were there. That's different." Nobody argued with him. Outside, the city was doing what it always did. Moving, noisy, complicated, full of people who had not yet figured out how to locate themselves in a world where the largest piece of the story they'd been told had just been publicly shown to be false. That process was going to take a long time. It was going to be loud and ugly, and several additional people were going to be hurt by the things that came out of the hole where the story used to be. None of that had been prevented. It had only been made visible. Butcher got up and left the bar and walked into the Queen's night, and the world was the same as it had been before in every physical respect, and entirely different in every other, and that difference was neither victory nor defeat. It was just what was left.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and be sure to turn on notifications so you won't miss our future videos. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.